The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a rider, who did not bother to dismount politely. He tossed the sealed envelope through the open window of the Voss household dining room, turned his horse around, and left without a word. The envelope landed on the breakfast table, between a dish of cold eggs and a pot of tea that had already gone lukewarm. Mara Voss was the one who picked it up. She was 22 years old, with brown hair she kept pinned back because she found loose hair annoying, and steady hands that rarely shook. She looked at the envelope, noted the dark wax seal pressed with the image of a standing wolf, and felt something cold move through her chest. She set it back down without opening it and called for her father. Her father, George Voss, took 3 minutes to come downstairs. He was a man who had once been proud and well-dressed, but years of poor decisions had worn him down to a version of himself that looked borrowed from someone better. His coat was brushed but fraying at the sleeves. His eyes were tired in a way that sleep no longer fixed. He came into the dining room still buttoning his cuffs, and stopped when he saw the seal on the envelope. He knew that seal. Every family in the province knew that seal. He sat down heavily in his chair. He picked up the letter. He held it for a moment, without opening it, the way a person holds something they know will change things. Then he broke the wax and read. Mara watched his face. She had learned, over the years, to read her father the way some people read weather. The slight tightening around his eyes meant trouble. The slow exhale through his nose meant the trouble was serious. Both of those things happened now, one after the other. "What does it say?" she asked. "It is a formal summons," her father said. He set the letter flat on the table. From the estate of Duke Aldrich Vane, Ilara is requested to present herself at Vane Manor within a fortnight for the purpose of a formal introduction. The room went quiet. Outside, a horse pulled a cart past the window. A bird called once from the garden, and then did not call again. "A formal introduction," Mara said slowly. "He wants to consider her for marriage." "That is what the letter implies, yes." Mara looked at the letter lying on the table. The handwriting was angular and controlled, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who has never been in a hurry in their life. She read the name at the bottom. Aldrich Vane, Duke of Careth. Everyone in the province had a story about Aldrich Vane. The stories were not pleasant. He was said to be a man of absolute silence and colder judgment. 3 years ago, he had dismissed his entire household staff overnight, after discovering one of them had borrowed a horse without permission, not spoken harshly to them, not reduced their wages, simply dismissed all 12 of them before sunrise, with nothing more than 2 weeks' pay and a letter of reference written by his steward. He had then hired all new staff from a neighboring province, where no one would know him by reputation. 2 years ago, he had taken a man to court over a land boundary dispute that involved less than an acre of ground. He had won. The man's family had been paying the legal settlement in installments ever since. No one had seen him smile. Several people claimed he did not know how. He was also, and this was the uncomfortable part, the wealthiest and most powerful man within 4 days' ride. George Voss looked at the letter for another moment, then folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. "I will tell Ilara," he said. "She will refuse," Mara said. "She will do what is necessary for this family," her father said, but he said it quietly, without the force of real conviction, and they both heard the emptiness in it. Ilara Voss was 24 years old and had her mother's cheekbones and her grandmother's stubbornness. She was beautiful, in the way that made people look twice at her in the market, but she had always known it, and had long since stopped caring about it. She cared about music, about her garden, about the 3 novels she kept on her bedside table, and rotated between depending on her mood. She was not unkind. She was not weak. She simply had a very clear idea of what she wanted from her life, and Duke Aldrich Vane was not part of it. When their father told her at dinner that evening, Ilara put down her fork. She looked at her father. She looked at her mother, Clara, who was sitting very still, with her hands folded in her lap. She looked at Mara, who gave her a very small shake of the head that meant, "I am not going to pretend this is fine." Then Ilara pushed back her chair, stood up and said, "No." She walked out of the dining room. They heard her footsteps on the stairs. They heard her bedroom door close, not slam. Ilara did not slam doors. She simply closed it, which was somehow worse. George Voss stared at the table. Clara reached out and touched his arm once, briefly. Mara looked at her plate and thought about the wolf on the wax seal. That night, the household did not sleep well. Mara lay in her bed and listened to the old house settle around her. She could hear, faintly, her father pacing in his study. She had learned not to go to him when he paced. He was not the kind of man who could be comforted. He was the kind of man who needed to arrive at things on his own, even when his own was the long, wrong road. She thought about their situation, the way she often did when she could not sleep, laying it out in her mind like a map. The debts were real. She had seen enough of the household accounts to understand they were past the point of being solved by small economies. Her father had borrowed against the house twice in the last 4 years. He had borrowed from 2 separate lending firms in the city. He had, most recently, borrowed from a private source that charged interest she did not want to calculate. Marriage to a wealthy man was not a romantic solution. It was an arithmetical one. But arithmetic did not care about fear. She was still awake when she heard her mother come up the stairs and stop outside Ilara's door. She heard her mother knock softly and then enter. She heard nothing after that, because their voices were too low, and Mara had too much respect for her sister to press her ear to the wall. She must have slept eventually, because she woke to gray morning light and the sound of her mother in the hallway, walking back toward the master bedroom with heavy, tired footsteps that told Mara everything she needed to know about how the conversation with Ilara had ended. She dressed and went downstairs and found her father already at the table with a cold cup of tea and a notebook full of numbers he had been staring at since before the sun came up. He did not look up when she sat down. She poured herself tea from the pot and waited. "She will not go," her father said finally. "I know," Mara said. "She said she would rather—" He stopped. He closed the notebook. "She is certain. What will you do?" Her father looked at her then, and she saw something in his face that she had not expected. Not frustration, not anger, something quieter and more troubling than both of those things. He looked like a man who had already thought of something he was ashamed of. "Your mother had an idea," he said. Mara set down her teacup. "Go on." "The Duke has never met Ilara. He has only her name and a brief written description from his correspondence with my solicitor. He does not know what she looks like. He does not know her voice, her habits, how she carries herself." The room was very still. "You and Ilara are only 2 years apart," her father continued. "You have similar coloring. You are both." He searched for the word. "You are both capable young women." Mara looked at her father. "You want me to go instead of her," she said. The words came out flat, without inflection, because she was not certain yet whether she was horrified or simply absorbing the shape of the thing. "Not to commit to anything," her father said quickly. "Not to agree to anything. Only to attend the initial introduction, to buy Ilara more time. Perhaps, if you were to simply present yourself and be polite and not say anything to offend him, we might have another month before he expects an answer. And in that time—" "And in that time what?" Mara asked. Her father did not answer. The truth was, there was no good answer. There was only time, which her father still believed could fix things the way it once had, before the debts had grown heavy enough to have weight. Mara thought about it. She thought about Ilara, who had been so certain she said it in one word and walked out of the room. She thought about her mother's tired footsteps in the hallway. She thought about the notebook full of numbers that did not add up no matter which direction you looked at them. She thought about Duke Aldrich Vane, whose seal was a standing wolf, whose reputation was a long series of cold and efficient decisions, and who had never once been seen to smile. "What exactly would I be expected to do?" she asked. Her father leaned forward slightly. "Go to the manor. Meet him. Be polite. Be agreeable, without committing to anything. If he asks about the future, say that you prefer to take your time. He will respect someone who is not eager. From everything I have heard, he values composure." "You want me to pretend to be my sister," Mara said plainly. "I want you to protect this family," her father said. That was the moment. That was the exact sentence that moved the weight from one side of the scale to the other. Not because it was persuasive, exactly, but because it was true, and she knew it, and she had always known it, and there had never really been any version of this conversation that ended differently. She looked at her hands on the table. She looked at the closed notebook. "I will need 2 weeks to prepare," she said. Her father exhaled. He nodded. He reached across and briefly pressed her hand with his, a gesture he had not made since she was about 9 years old. It lasted only a moment, and then he pulled back and became himself again, the man with the notebooks and the numbers and the tired eyes. Mara went upstairs and knocked on Alara's door. "Come in," said Alara. Mara opened the door. Alara was sitting on her bed with one of her novels open in her lap, but she was not reading it. She was looking at the window. She turned when Mara came in, and her eyes, which were usually calm, were red at the edges. Mara sat on the end of the bed. "I am going to go," Mara said, "as you. Just to the first meeting. Just to buy time." Alara stared at her. "You cannot do that," Alara said. "I can. I will. You do not have to do anything." "Mara." Alara set the book down. "That man. Everything people say about him." "People say many things," Mara said. "Not all of them are accurate. He dismissed 12 people overnight because one of them borrowed a horse. He gave them references and 2 weeks' wages," Mara said, "which is more than most employers would do." Alara looked at her, as if she had said something extraordinary. "You are defending him." "I am going to pretend to be you for a single afternoon," Mara said. "I am not marrying him. I am not agreeing to anything. I am simply going to a house, meeting a man, being polite, and coming home, and then we will have more time to think." There was a long pause. Alara looked at her with something complicated in her eyes. Guilt and relief, and something that might have been admiration, all tangled together. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked. Mara thought about that honestly. "Because you asked father and mother for nothing. You just said no and closed the door. That took courage. I want to make sure that courage is not wasted." Alara said nothing for a moment. Then she reached out and squeezed Mara's hand once, hard. "He will terrify you," Alara said softly. "Maybe," Mara said. "Or maybe he is just a man." She said it with more confidence than she felt. That evening, their mother took her into the back room, where the good dresses were kept, and began altering a dark green gown that had belonged to Alara for a formal occasion 3 winters ago. Clara Voss was a quiet woman who had learned to express most things through actions rather than words. She pinned and folded and stitched for nearly 2 hours without speaking. Then she said, without looking up from her work, "You are a better person than you give yourself credit for." Mara sat still on the fitting stool and looked at the candle burning on the windowsill. "I hope that is true," she said. "It is," her mother said simply, and pinned the last hem with such finality that it felt like a period at the end of a sentence. Outside, the wind was moving through the garden, the evening was settling into dark, and 2 days' ride away, behind the stone walls of a manor whose lights could be seen from the main road on clear nights, a man sat alone in a library that had not echoed with a second voice in 5 years. He did not know a young woman was being fitted into her sister's dress. He did not know that what was coming toward him was not what he had arranged for. He turned a page. The fire burned low. The wolf on his seal gazed from the desk without expression, the way things look when they are waiting. And somewhere in the distance, a rider was already preparing to carry a reply. The preparation for the trip took 11 days. Mara used every one of them. She sat with Alara for hours at a time, going through details that seemed small but were not. Alara's preferred tea was chamomile, not black. She held her fork in the continental style. She laughed at things before she understood them, and then caught herself. She touched the side of her neck when she was nervous, just below the ear, always with the right hand, always briefly. She had an opinion about art that she expressed whenever asked. She preferred landscapes to portraits because, as she once told Mara, a landscape could not stare back at you. Mara wrote none of this down. Writing it down felt wrong, like making a document of something that should not exist. Instead, she kept it in her head, turning it over and over until it felt natural, the way you learn the words to a song without meaning to. She also gathered what she could about the Duke himself, which was harder. The servants who had worked at Vane Manor before his mass dismissal 3 years ago had scattered, and most of those she could find through local connections were reluctant to speak. Not because they were loyal to him, they were not, but because speaking about him made them uncomfortable in a way they struggled to articulate. One woman, who had been a kitchen maid there for 2 years, said only, "He never raised his voice, not once." That was the most frightening thing about him. A person who never raises their voice is a person who does not need to. Mara thanked her and walked home and thought about that for a long time. She read what she could find in the newspaper archives her father kept in bundles in the study. The Duke was mentioned occasionally in reports about provincial affairs. He had spoken twice in front of the regional assembly, once about water rights and once about road maintenance. Both speeches, as transcribed, were short, precise, and entirely without flourish. He had donated money to the restoration of the old hospital in the city 3 winters back, a fact that a reporter had noted with some surprise, as if generosity from him required explanation. He was 41. He had been a duke since the age of 31, when his father died of a sudden illness. He was not known to hunt, which was unusual for a man of his position. He was known to read extensively, which was noted as though it were slightly odd. His wife had been called Catherine. She had died 5.5 years ago, along with their infant son, who had been born and died in the same week of a winter fever that moved through the estate like a silence. After that, the Duke had closed several of the public-facing rooms of Vane Manor. He had declined most social invitations. He had stopped attending the seasonal assemblies that the local nobility used to remind one another they existed. This was not in the newspapers. This was what Mara gathered from careful conversations with people who spoke carefully, in the way that careful people speak when they are telling you something they believe is private, but feel you need to know. She did not tell any of this to her father. It would not have helped him. Her father needed to believe that the Duke was simply a cold and powerful man who could be navigated, not a person who had quietly excised himself from everything that might cause him further pain. On the morning of the 12th day, Mara dressed in Alara's green gown, which their mother had altered to fit her perfectly. She looked at herself in the tall mirror in her sister's room, because it felt more accurate to use Alara's mirror than her own, and stood for a moment with her hands at her sides. She looked like herself. She hoped she looked like Alara. She was not sure which of those things was more unnerving. Alara came and stood behind her in the mirror. They were quiet for a moment, looking at each other's reflections. "Your hair," Alara said gently. "I always wear one curl loose on the left side. Here." She reached up and carefully freed a single strand from Mara's pin, curving it against her cheek. Mara looked at the change. It was small. It was the kind of small thing that the wrong person would notice instantly. "Thank you," she said. Alara met her eyes in the mirror. "Come home," she said. "Just come home." The carriage was waiting in the lane. Their father stood beside it, straight-backed, trying to look as though this was a normal thing that was happening. Their mother had packed a bag with a change of clothes, a small tin of biscuits, and a handkerchief pressed with lavender. The handkerchief was folded with more care than was strictly necessary, and Mara understood that it was the only version of comfort her mother knew how to deliver that morning. She climbed in. The driver clicked at the horses. The carriage rolled forward. Mara kept her hands flat on her knees and watched the Voss house disappear behind the bend in the lane. The garden, the front gate, the window of her own bedroom where her real self seemed to be standing watching. Then the road straightened, and there was only ahead. She was going to Vane Manor. She was going as someone else. And the only thing she was absolutely certain of was that the person she was going to meet had spent 5 years building walls around himself that were higher and thicker and colder than anything she had yet encountered in her life, and that she was walking directly toward them, carrying a name that was not her own. The carriage moved through the morning. The fields on either side were wide and pale with early autumn. The sky was the color of pewter, flat and even. There were no birds. Mara sat with her back straight, her hands still, the single curl loose against her left cheek, and thought of nothing at all. She was good at that. At a certain point in her life, she had learned that the best way to enter a hard thing was not to think about it. You put your mind somewhere quiet, and you let the wheels carry you, and you dealt with what was in front of you when it arrived. What was in front of her arrived at precisely 2 in the afternoon, when the carriage came around a long bend, and Vane Manor appeared against the gray sky. It was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something cold and narrow, the way a person with a cold and narrow reputation is assumed to live. Instead, the manor was broad and old and very still, built from dark stone that had been there long enough to look like it had grown from the ground rather than been placed on it. The grounds were neat, without being decorative. The trees were large and old. There were no flowers by the front path, only a precise line of low hedges that had been trimmed recently. The carriage stopped. A man came down the front steps. Not the Duke, just a staff member, older, with the careful face of someone who had worked in this house long enough to have learned its rhythms. "Miss Voss," he said. "Yes," said Mara. She stepped down from the carriage. She looked up at the house. One of the upper windows had a light in it, yellow and steady, like a single eye that had been watching the lane. She followed the man up the steps, through the front door, and into the hall of Vane Manor. The silence inside was different from the silence outside. Outside, silence is just the absence of noise. Inside this house, the silence had texture. It had been there a long time. It had settled into the walls and the floors and the high ceilings the way old things settle. Mara took a breath. She stood in the hall. She thought of nothing. And then, from somewhere down the long corridor, she heard measured footsteps coming toward her. Unhurried, quiet, as certain as the ticking of a clock. He was coming. He was taller than she had expected. That was the first thing. She had built an image of him in her mind over the preparation days, assembled from rumors and newspaper transcripts and the careful words of careful people. And somehow she had made him smaller, more contained. The reality of him filled the corridor in a way that her imagined version had not. Duke Aldrich Vane walked toward her with the unhurried ease of someone who had never needed to rush toward anything, because everything he needed had always eventually arrived. He was lean and long-limbed, dressed in dark gray, with no decoration beyond a single silver button at his collar. The scar along his jaw, which she had not known about until this moment, was old and faded, a thin line that ran from just below his left ear to the edge of his chin. His hair was dark with some gray at the temples. His eyes, when he stopped and looked at her, were the color of deep water on a day without sun. He did not smile. He looked at her the way she had been told he looked at things, with complete attention and no visible reaction, as though he were reading something in a language he already knew. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was quieter than she had imagined, not soft. There was nothing soft about it, but controlled. It was the voice of someone who chose every word before it arrived. "Your Grace," Mara said. She did not flinch. She held his gaze. She had decided, somewhere on the road here, that the worst thing she could do was seem afraid of him, because fear would make her hesitate, and hesitation would make her less convincing. So she looked back at him with the same steadiness he gave her, and waited. Something moved in his expression. It was too small to name. He turned slightly and gestured toward the corridor. "You must be tired from the journey," he said. "The sitting room is prepared." She followed him. Her heart was doing something she was choosing to ignore. The sitting room was at the end of the main corridor, a large, high-ceilinged space with a long window that looked out over the rear grounds of the estate. There were 2 chairs arranged near the fireplace and a low table set with a tea service that had already been poured. He had known the exact time of her arrival. She filed that away. He gestured to one of the chairs. She sat. He took the other. She waited for him to speak. He waited for her. This was, she realized immediately, a test of a particular kind. Not a spoken test, a patience test. He wanted to see whether she would fill the silence with something anxious, something meaningless, the way people fill silences when they are uncomfortable. She had heard that he valued composure, and now she understood why. He was measuring her by it from the first moment. She looked at the fire. She let the silence be. 40 seconds passed, perhaps 50. She counted them without counting them. Then the Duke said, "You are not what I expected." She looked at him. "I hope that is not a disappointment," she said. "I did not say that," he said. There was no warmth in it, but there was precision, and something about the precision was almost interesting. He was a man who said exactly what he meant, and nothing more, which was unusual enough to be notable. "What were you expecting?" she asked. He considered the question briefly. "Your father's letters described you as thoughtful and composed. Most descriptions from fathers are optimistic. Most daughters," Mara said, "are also different in person than they are in their father's letters." That pause again. The slight, unnameable shift in his expression. "That is true," he said. The tea sat between them. He had not reached for his. She waited a moment, and then reached for hers. because she had decided she was not going to perform more composure than was natural. A woman who refused to drink her tea simply to appear unconcerned would be performing. Mara was not performing. She was simply being a person in a room. She drank her tea. It was very good. She noted that. Vane Manor is beautiful, she said. I did not expect the grounds to be so large. The original family had different priorities than I do, the Duke said. They built for display. I have left it largely as it was. But not entirely, she said. He looked at her. The flowers, she said. You removed them from the front path. The soil there is rich and dark, which means it was worked recently. But there are no beds. A pause that was different from the previous ones. This one had something in it she could not immediately classify. You noticed that, he said. It was not a question. I noticed several things, she said. Such as? Your library door is half open, she said. I saw it as we walked past. The books nearest the door are well used. The spines are pale from handling. The books further in look less touched, which means you read in layers, working through the easiest to reach first, which is something a person does when they spend a great deal of time in a room, but are often interrupted by their own thoughts. The Duke looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Mara began to wonder whether she had said too much, whether Alara would have said something like that, or whether she had just broken character in the first 40 minutes of what was supposed to be a single careful afternoon. But she held still. She did not take it back. Taking it back would be worse. You are observant, he said finally. I try to be useful, she said. Observation is the beginning of being useful. That pause again. That small, unclassifiable thing in his face. Shall I show you the grounds? He said. There is still sufficient light. She had expected a formal tour of the house, the kind of structured display that aristocratic households staged for guests, showing off the old portraits and the correct number of dining chairs. She had not expected to be taken outside immediately, walked along the rear paths of the estate at a pace that was neither too fast nor too slow, with very little commentary from her host. But that was what happened. He walked beside her, and occasionally he would point to something. The old orchard wall, the herb garden, the stone bench near the far hedge that he mentioned in passing had been placed there by his grandmother, and he would say something brief and accurate about it, and then fall silent again. And Mara would look at the thing and say something she actually thought about it, because she had decided somewhere between the sitting room and the back door that performing being Alara was less useful than simply being herself with a different name. The air smelled of turned earth and the faint bitterness of late autumn leaves. The grounds were quieter than any grounds she had been on, because there were no dogs and no children, and no one doing anything that made a sound, just the two of them walking on the gravel path, and the large sky overhead, and the old stone of the manor at their backs. Did you design the herb garden yourself? She asked, because it was well organized in a way that felt intentional and personal. My wife did, he said. His voice did not change when he said it. It was the same steady, controlled instrument it always was. But he did not say anything after it, and they walked past the herb garden without stopping, and she understood, with a clarity she did not analyze, that she should not press. She did not press. The sun was leaning toward the tree line by the time they returned to the house. The steward, the older man with the careful face, was waiting near the door, which she understood to mean that the day's allotted time was concluding. She felt a complicated thing in her chest that she chose not to look at directly. The Duke stopped at the foot of the steps. Your rooms have been prepared, he said. She stopped. I had not expected to stay. The journey is too long for a single day, he said. If you intend to return tomorrow, you will need to rest tonight. It was so stated, so simple, so arranged, without asking, that she almost said she would not stay. Almost. But she looked at his face, and what she saw there was not the arrogance she had expected from that kind of statement. It was something more careful than that. Something that took account of practical realities and solved them without drama. Thank you, she said. Good evening, Miss Voss, the Duke said. He inclined his head slightly and went up the steps and into the house. The steward led her to a guest room that had clearly been prepared carefully. Fresh linens, a fire already burning, a dinner tray set with soup and bread, and a small dish of preserved fruit that was better than anything she had tasted in months. She sat at the small table by the window and ate alone, and looked out at the grounds in the dark. The old orchard was a black shape against the gray night. Somewhere out there was the stone bench his grandmother had placed, and the herb garden his wife had designed. She thought about that, about a person who kept those things in place and unchanged, who kept the herb garden growing, and tended and precise, not because they used it, or because it was beautiful, but because removing it would mean something they were not ready for. She thought about the library, with its worked pale spines near the door, and its unread shelves in the back. She thought about a man sitting in a large house in which the silence had been there so long it had learned to be comfortable. Then, she put those thoughts aside, because they were not useful. She was here for one purpose. She was buying time for Alara. She was being polite, being careful, being composed. She was going home tomorrow. She was not going to examine the contents of this man's quietness as if it were a room she might want to know better. She was not. She finished her soup. She went to bed. The fire burned steadily in the grate and threw orange light across the ceiling, and outside the wind moved through the old trees with the slow patience of something that had been doing this long before the house was built and intended to keep doing it long after. In the morning, she rose early and dressed and came downstairs to find that the dining room was already set for breakfast and that the Duke was already at the table, reading. He did not look up immediately. He finished his page. Then he set the book down and looked at her in the same way he had looked at her the day before, completely, without rush, without revealing anything that he had not decided to reveal. "You slept," he said. "I did," she said. "The room was very comfortable. My steward arranged it. He arranged it well." She sat. Breakfast was simple and very good. They ate without speaking for a while, which she found she did not mind. Most people needed to fill their silences with other people. He did not, she realized, sometime between the toast and the second cup of tea, that she did not either. "You have a long return journey," he said. "Yes," she said. She set down her cup. "I should leave before mid-morning." He nodded. And then, and she was not expecting it, and it arrived with the plainness of everything else he said, "I would prefer if you stayed a few more days." The room paused. Or she paused. She was not certain. "A few more days," she said carefully. "There are parts of the estate I did not show you yesterday. The matter of a formal introduction is better conducted over more than a single evening." He looked at his tea, then at her. "If that is agreeable." Mara thought of her father's face. She thought of the letter she would need to send. She thought of Alara's words, "Just come home." She thought of the library with the pale spines and the unread dark. "I can stay 2 more days," she said. "After that, I have obligations at home." 2 days is sufficient, he said, and returned to his book. She sat across the table from him in the morning light, the one curl loose against her left cheek, her hands around a teacup, and thought, "This is not what anyone told me this would be." And she did not know whether to be relieved about that or more frightened. She looked out the window at the old trees, which were still and golden in the early light. She stayed. She sent a letter home that morning, brief and without detail, handed to the Duke's rider, who left just after breakfast. She wrote that she had been asked to extend her visit and that she had agreed for 2 more days. She said the household was well run and the grounds were large. She said nothing about the tea, or the walk, or the library, or the bench in the garden. She said she would write again before she left. The writer took the letter without expression and went. The Duke had not asked what she wrote, which she noted. The second day moved differently from the first. The household had rhythm, quiet, orderly, without excess, and by mid-morning she had begun to understand its pattern. The gardener came at 9 and worked until noon on the far side of the estate. The cook prepared the day's main meal in the early afternoon. The steward moved through the house in a circuit that took approximately 40 minutes, and then repeated. No one spoke unless spoken to, not because they were afraid, but because the house itself did not encourage noise. The Duke worked in the morning. She did not see him between breakfast and noon. She was given the run of the ground floor and the garden, which felt more like thoughtful hospitality than anything else. She spent the morning in the library. The library was exactly as she had seen from the doorway. Wide, high-shelved, with a fireplace and 2 reading chairs, positioned close enough to suggest that once, not so long ago, this had been a room meant for 2 people, and had simply forgotten to reorganize itself for one. She read. She did not snoop. She was careful to handle nothing that was not on the main shelves. The books near the door were, as she had observed, well used: novels, histories, a series of annotated volumes on provincial land law. The annotations were in a small, tight hand, the kind of hand that wrote to be accurate, rather than to be read by someone else. She found, on the second shelf, a book she had read herself 2 years ago, a history of the Northern Territories, written by an explorer who had crossed the mountain range above the snow line and survived to describe it in excellent detail. She pulled it out and held it. The spine was worn. A page was folded down in the middle, not neatly, quickly, the way you fold a page when something outside the book pulls you away before you are ready. She put it back exactly as she had found it. At noon, the Duke appeared in the library doorway. He had changed coats, darker than this morning, less formal. He looked at her, at the book in her hands, at the specific shelf she had been standing before. "That shelf is primarily early geography," he said. "I noticed," Mara said. "You have the full Hartwell collection." He looked at her again, and she was beginning to understand what that particular look meant. It was not surprise. He was not a man who showed surprise easily. It was something closer to adjustment, the look of a person who has built an expectation in their head and is now quietly revising it to match what is actually in front of them. "Very few people know Hartwell," he said. "My father has a partial collection," she said. "He gave me the 3rd and 4th volumes when I was 12. I read them in 4 days." She said this without thinking about whether Alara had read Hartwell or not. The words came from a real place and went toward a real person, and she felt the falseness of everything else she was doing, pressed against the truth of that single moment. He stepped into the library. He pulled the 4th volume from the shelf, the one about the crossing of the snow line, and opened it. He turned to a page near the end and held it toward her. "What do you think of his conclusion?" he said. She took the book. She read the page. She had read it before and remembered it, and she told him what she actually thought about it, which was that the explorer had been brave, but had drawn the wrong lessons from his own experience, and had not understood that surviving a hard thing does not make the hard thing less dangerous. The Duke sat down. "I wrote something similar in the margin," he said, "several years ago." She looked and found it. Small, tight letters in the margin, in that same hand that wrote to be accurate, rather than to be read. She read it. His thought was better expressed than hers, which she told him, and he looked at her, with that adjustment expression again. They talked about the book for almost an hour. Then they talked about the 2nd volume, and then about another book entirely, a history of trade routes that led to a disagreement about the economics of distance, that neither of them resolved before the cook came to say that the afternoon meal was ready. They ate together, more quietly than they had talked, and then the Duke excused himself to return to his work, and Mara went back to the garden and stood in the gray afternoon light, feeling something she was determined to classify only as confusion, and not as anything warmer than that. On the morning of the 3rd day, before she was due to leave, the Duke joined her for breakfast again. They did not discuss books this time. He asked about her family, carefully, generally, the way someone asks about things they have read about, rather than experienced directly. She answered carefully, keeping Alara's facts in place of her own, feeling the edges of the lie against the inside of her words like a stone in a shoe she had decided to ignore. "You should not rush your return," he said, as she stood to leave. "I have family obligations," she said. "I cannot stay longer." He nodded. He stood. He walked her to the front door himself, which the steward told her later. She asked, because she needed to know, was something the Duke had not done for a departing visitor in at least 3 years. "Thank you for the introduction," Mara said. She stood at the top of the steps with the gray morning around her, and the carriage waiting below. "I will write to your father," the Duke said. Her heart did something she ignored. "I hope the communication is agreeable," she said. He looked at her for a moment. That look. That long, complete, nothing-given-away look. "I expect it will be," he said. She walked down the steps. She climbed into the carriage. She did not look back at the manor as the carriage moved down the drive, because she had decided not to, and she was very good at the things she decided. She looked at her hands in her lap instead. They were steady. They were always steady. But something behind the steadiness was moving in a direction she had not authorized it to move. She looked out at the road unwinding ahead of her. She thought of her father receiving the Duke's letter. She thought of Alara's relief. She thought of the stone bench in the garden, and the herb garden that was still kept growing, and the library with its 2 reading chairs arranged for a company that no longer came. She thought about none of those things, she told herself. She looked at the road. She thought about the road. The letter from Duke Aldrich Vane arrived at the Voss household before Mara did. The Duke's rider was faster than a carriage, and the letter had been placed on her father's desk, and read and reread twice by the time her carriage turned up the lane in the late afternoon. George Voss met her at the front door, which he had not done since she was a child. He looked 10 years younger than he had when she left. His coat was brushed without fraying at the cuffs. He was almost smiling. He shook her hand rather than embracing her, which was his way of saying, "You have done something significant, and I know it, and I cannot yet say it aloud." "He wants to proceed," her father said, even before she was through the doorway. Mara removed her coat. She handed it to the housekeeper. She said, "Proceed how?" "He has proposed a second visit, a longer one, 1 week. He has written that the introduction was promising, and that he wishes to continue the formal arrangement." Her father pressed the letter into her hands. She read it. The Duke's handwriting was exactly what she would have expected from his margin notes. Tight, angular, accurate. He used few adjectives. He stated his intentions with the directness of someone who had never seen the point of preamble. He found the introduction favorable. He proposed a second meeting of 1 week's duration at his estate, with appropriate arrangements for the young lady's comfort, and the presence of a chaperone if preferred. He asked for a reply within 10 days. Mara folded the letter. She handed it back. "I cannot go again," she said. Her father's expression did not change exactly, but something in it rearranged itself. "Mara. Father. I went as Alara for a single visit, 1 dinner, and 2 more days. That was the arrangement. I have done that. It is enough. You have a month, at least, to work with this. Use it." "He does not want a month," her father said. "He wants to proceed. Do you understand what that means? The man who has refused every social engagement for 5 years wants to actively continue a courtship. That is a problem," Mara said quietly. Her father stopped. "It is not a victory," she said. "He thinks he is corresponding with Alara. He has invited Alara to his home for a week. Not me. Not a substitute. Not a temporary stand-in for a family emergency. When this proceeds to an actual arrangement, and he meets the real Alara, one of 2 things will happen. Either she will refuse him openly, or he will discover the deception. And I am more afraid of the second thing than the first." Her father looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the letter. "He liked you," he said. "He liked whoever he met," she said. "He does not know who that was." There was a long pause. In the garden outside the window, the last of the autumn roses were browning at the edges. The afternoon light was yellow and thin. Her mother appeared at the top of the stairs, listened, and came down slowly, one hand on the rail, saying nothing. "We need 1 week," her father said finally. "1 more week. Just to cement the relationship enough that when the truth comes out, there is something worth preserving." "The truth will come out," Mara said. "Yes," said her father. "But its timing matters enormously. A man who has been lied to for 1 day is angry. A man who has been lied to for 3 weeks is invested. Angry and invested is survivable. Angry and not invested is ruin." Mara looked at him. She had not expected her father to be this calculating. She had spent years watching him fail at calculations, watching him borrow and delay, and assume that something would sort itself out without intervention. But here he was, laying out the logic of the deception, with the precision of someone who had been thinking about little else. "You have thought about this very carefully," she said. "I have thought about nothing else for 3 days," he said. Mara walked to the window. She looked at the garden, the roses, the brown edges, the thin yellow light. She thought about Vane Manor's garden, which was large and gray, and kept with a different kind of care. Not decorative care, but necessary care. The kind that says, "These things existed, and I will not let them disappear." She thought about the library, the books, the 2 chairs. She thought about a man saying, "I would prefer if you stayed a few more days." She turned around. "What does Alara say?" she asked. Her father said nothing, which was itself an answer. Clara Voss, from the middle of the staircase, said quietly, "She says it is your choice." Mara looked at her mother. She says, Clara continued, choosing each word, that she will not ask it of you, but that she is not asking you to stop either. Which meant Alara was going to let her decide. Alara was going to sit in her room, with her novels and her garden and her perfectly intact dignity, and she was going to let her younger sister choose, because that was the kind of person Alara was. Someone who would not push you off a cliff, but would also not catch you if you chose to jump. Mara looked at the letter in her father's hand. 1 week. 7 days at a manor where the silence was old and deep. 7 days pretending to be someone she was not, to a man who had noticed the flowers missing from the front path, and whose wife's herb garden was still growing, and who had spent 5 years in a house with 2 reading chairs arranged for a conversation that could not happen anymore. This was wrong. She knew it was wrong. She was about to make it more wrong. I will go, she said. 1 week, and then I am telling him the truth. Her father began to speak. No, she said, and it came out with a force that surprised even her. You do not get to negotiate that part. 1 week, and then I tell him. If this falls apart because of that, then it falls apart. But I will not build a real relationship on a false name. I will not do that to him, and I will not do it to myself. Her father looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that might, in different circumstances, have been respect. All right, he said. Mara went upstairs. She knocked on Alara's door. Come in, said Alara. She was at her window seat with a novel, but the novel was face down and closed, and it was obvious she had not been reading it. She looked at Mara when she came in, and her face had the expression of someone who already knows the answer to the question they are about to be asked. I am going back, Mara said. Alara nodded. 1 week, Mara said. And then, I am going to tell him. Alara looked at her. And if it goes badly? Then it goes badly, Mara said. But it will not go badly, because I chose the easy option. Alara was quiet for a moment. What is he like? She said. Truly, not what father said. What is he actually like? Mara thought about this honestly. She sat on the end of the bed, the way she had that first morning, and she thought about it, and then she said, he is not what any of the stories say. He is very still, and very precise, and he has not had a conversation that meant something to him in a long time. He keeps things the way they were when he was not alone, because he does not know how to move them yet. He is not cruel, he is not cold, he is just careful, in the way that something becomes careful when it has been broken and put back together, and is afraid of the same thing happening again. Alara stared at her. Mara, she said slowly. What? Mara said. Alara said nothing. She just looked at her with that complicated expression again. Guilt and relief, and now something new underneath both of them, that Mara did not want to have named. It is fine, Mara said, too quickly. It is just, I observe things. You know that. I described him accurately. You described him as a person, Alara said. He is a person. Most people who talk about him describe him as a situation, a problem to be managed, a resource to be acquired. Alara looked at her carefully. You described him the way you describe a book you have just read and cannot stop thinking about. That is not. Mara stopped. Alara. I know, Alara said, quietly and without satisfaction. I know. Go if you are going. Tell him when you are ready to tell him. She paused. Just be careful, Mara. Not with him. With yourself. Mara stood up. She went to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. I am always careful, she said. I know, said Alara. That is precisely what worries me. The preparations for the second visit moved faster than the first. There was less fear this time, which was almost worse. Fear, at least, was clarifying. What she felt now was more complicated and had more layers, and she dealt with it by being more organized than necessary and thinking only about practical things. She packed more carefully this time. Her own books, 3 of them, because 7 days was too long without something to read. Her own preferred ink and paper, a letter she had already composed to send home on the 4th day of the visit, which meant she had already planned the shape of the week before it began, which was another thing she noticed about herself and then deliberately stopped noticing. She sat with Alara for one last evening. They did not talk about the Duke. They talked about small things, the state of the garden, a neighbor's dog that had escaped into their yard twice that week, the novel Alara was reading, which she described as deeply unrealistic, but nevertheless satisfying. Mara laughed at the right moments, and felt the normalcy of it settle over her like something she was already beginning to miss from a distance. In the morning, the carriage came again. Her mother pressed the same lavender handkerchief into her hands, and then held her hand briefly before letting go. Her father shook her hand again. Alara watched from the window. Mara climbed in. The driver clicked. The wheels turned. This time, as the house disappeared behind the bend in the lane, she looked at it. She let herself look. She watched the garden and the front gate and the window of Alara's room until the road curved and took it from her. Then she faced forward. The road stretched ahead, pale and straight in the early morning. The fields were quieter than before, deeper into autumn now, the color of something that is preparing to be done with itself for a season. She was going back to a house where she did not belong. She was going back with a name that was not hers, and a plan to eventually give that name up, and no certainty of what came after. She was going back because she had said she would, because her family needed her to, because she had looked at a man sitting in a house full of things he had kept exactly in place, and had not been able to make herself treat that as simply a resource to be managed. She was going back. The road went on. The sky was gray and even, and somewhere ahead of her, beyond the long fields and the far line of trees, the lights of Vane Manor were burning steadily in the autumn cold, as they had burned every night for 5 years, against a darkness that had long since learned to wait. She arrived at Vane Manor in the early afternoon, and this time the arrival felt different. The manor did not loom the way it had on the first visit. It simply appeared around the bend, the way a familiar place appears, with its wide dark stones, and its large old trees, and its line of trimmed hedges running precise and clean along the front path. The same steward came down the steps. His name, she had learned in the first visit, was Edmund. He was a man of about 60, with a face that had committed long ago to expressing absolutely nothing, and he ran the household with a quiet efficiency that she had come to recognize as the thing that kept the manor from feeling abandoned. "Miss Voss," he said. "Edmund," she said. Something flickered at the edge of his expression. He had not expected her to use his name. He took the slight informality in stride, because that was what Edmund did. He took everything in stride. He carried her trunk upstairs, the same guest room from before. She stood in the doorway and saw that it had been prepared with small changes. A second lamp on the writing desk, and a stack of books placed there. 3 of them, from the library, set with care rather than at random. She looked at the titles. One was the 5th volume of the Hartwell Geography series, the one that came after the 2 she had mentioned reading. The other 2 were histories she had not encountered before, but which were clearly from the same period as books she had mentioned finding interesting. He had put those books there. She stood for a moment, holding her own bag, looking at the 3 books on the desk. Then she set down the bag, took off her travel coat, and went downstairs to find him. He was in the library, standing, not sitting, near the far shelves that she had noted on her first visit as the less used ones. He was holding a book but not reading it, and he was looking at the window, at the gray afternoon beyond it, in the manner of someone who has been thinking about something and has not quite finished. He heard her come in, and turned. "You arrived without difficulty," he said. "The road is good," she said. "Thank you for the books." He looked at her briefly. "The Hartwell collection is complete. You mentioned having only the 3rd and 4th. "I did," she said. "I appreciate the thought." A pause. It was simply practical. She did not argue with him about whether it was simply practical. She had learned already that he expressed consideration in the language of practicality, and that what he called a practical arrangement was often something that required more attention than utility strictly demanded. "Shall I walk the grounds again, or would you prefer to show me the indoor portions of the estate?" she asked. He looked at her. "What would you prefer?" This, she noted, was a change from the first visit, where he had made the decisions. He was asking her. She filed that away, without making too much of it, because she was being careful. "Indoors," she said. "I have been in a carriage all morning." He showed her the east wing first. Most of it was closed. Rooms that had been shuttered, curtains drawn, furniture covered. He opened each door briefly and said what the room had been used for. and she noticed that he spoke about some rooms in the present tense and some in the past, and the ones in the past were the ones that had been his wife's particular spaces, a small sitting room that faced south, which had been used for morning reading, a music room at the end of the hall with a piano that had not been tuned in some years and stood behind its dust cover, the way something waits that has given up believing it will be used again. She did not comment on the piano. She looked at it for a moment and then moved on, the way you move on from a door someone has not yet decided whether to open. He showed her the dining room properly. She had only seen it in formal arrangement before, and now saw that in daily use it was a smaller, closer space, with only one end of the long table set for use, and the rest of it bare, and available for papers and correspondence, which told her he worked here as well as in his study. "You keep the full space functional," she said. He looked at her. "You use one end of the table," she said, "but you could have had the furniture moved to a smaller room. You kept the full table." He was quiet for a moment. "The room functions better at its original scale." She did not say, "Or you cannot bring yourself to reduce it." She did not say it, but she thought it, and thought it with more gentleness than analysis. The rest of the afternoon was spent in a way that Mara could not have predicted from the outside, working. The Duke had letters to review, and she sat at the other end of the dining room table, with the Hartwell fifth volume, and read while he wrote, and the room settled into a comfortable, productive, and entirely unexpected shared quiet. She read 4 chapters. He wrote 6 letters. When the light outside dropped enough to require candles, Edmund appeared and lit them without asking, and the room shifted to evening. "You read quickly," the Duke said, looking at the pages she had turned. "I always have," she said. "My mother said it was a problem, until she realized it was not." "Why would it be a problem?" "Because I finish books and want more of them, and books cost money, and she did not want the habit to become expensive." She smiled at the memory. "Then I simply started reading my father's books, which cost nothing additional." "And then the Hartwell volumes," he said. "And then the Hartwell volumes," she agreed. He set down his pen. He looked at her across the long table, across the candles and the papers, and the comfortable debris of 2 people who had spent several hours in the same room, without needing to perform for each other. "The first time I had this room lit with candles in the evening was 3 years ago," he said. "My solicitor came to discuss the land dispute. Before that." He stopped. He looked at the candles. She did not fill the pause. "I had grown accustomed to eating early," he said finally, "before the light went, because there was no one to talk with into the evening, and an empty room with candles is," he stopped again. "More empty than a room with daylight," she said. He looked at her, that look again, adjusted, recalibrated. "Yes," he said. She looked down at her book. She turned a page she had already read, because she needed something to do with her hands. This was the part that was not in the plan. This was the part that happened when you sat in rooms with people and let the quiet do what it wanted. This was the part that her father had not calculated for when he said that 3 weeks was enough to make a man invested. What her father had not counted on was that Mara was also a person who had rooms full of quiet, who had spent years in a house that was struggling and pretended it was not, and had been composed about it, because composition was the one thing she was reliably good at, and had never once had anyone sit across a table from her in candlelight and say something that made the composition feel, briefly, unnecessary. She turned the page back. "I should read," she said, "before the light goes." "Yes," said the Duke. He picked up his pen. "Read." She read. He wrote. The candles burned. Outside, the autumn night pressed itself against the windows, and the old trees stood in the dark. And somewhere in the manor the clocks ticked in the way that clocks tick in old houses. Not urgently, just steadily, as a reminder that time is moving whether you are doing something with it or not. On the 4th day, something happened that she had not planned for. She was in the garden, near the herb section, that the Duke's wife had planted, and that was still kept growing, with the same precision as everything else on the estate. She was walking and not thinking about things she had decided not to think about, and she came around the hedgerow corner and almost walked directly into Lord Philip Crane. Philip Crane was the second son of a family whose estate was 2 hours north. She had met him at a summer gathering 3 years ago, and again at a cousin's wedding the previous spring. He had met both her and Alara on those occasions. He had danced with Alara at the wedding. He had talked with Mara about horses, which she found more interesting than dancing. He recognized her immediately. "Miss Mara Voss," he said, with genuine pleasure and zero complication, because he was a straightforward person who found life reasonably good and had not yet encountered a reason to complicate his expressions. "What a surprise. Are you visiting Vane as well? I had business with the Duke this morning about a boundary matter." Everything in Mara went very still. "Lord Crane," she said, "how good to see you. I did not know you were acquainted with the Duke," he said. She heard, from somewhere behind her, the measured footsteps of the Duke himself crossing the garden toward them. "My sister is," she said, quickly and quietly. "She is staying here currently." Philip Crane looked at her. Something in his expression became gently puzzled. "But you are my sister Alara," she said, and looked at him with all of the steady intentionality she possessed, which was considerable. "You know how similar we look, Lord Crane. People confuse us constantly." He stared at her for one long, suspended second. He opened his mouth. The Duke arrived at her side. "Crane," said the Duke, "I see you have met my guest." "Indeed," said Philip Crane, with a face that was working very hard to express nothing. He looked at Mara. He looked at the Duke. "A pleasure to see you, Miss Voss," he said, and the pause was half a second too long, and then it was over. The three of them stood in the garden in the gray autumn light and talked about the boundary matter for 2 minutes, and then Philip Crane excused himself to begin his journey home. He looked back once from the gate. Mara looked at the herb garden and kept her hands very still. "He seems surprised to see you," the Duke said. "Lord Crane is easily surprised," Mara said. "He has a very expressive face." She said it with such composure that the Duke accepted it, or appeared to, or she told herself he appeared to, because the alternative, that he had noticed exactly what had almost happened, and had filed it away in that precise, angular, nothing-wasted mind of his, was not something she could afford to sit with in the middle of a garden. She turned back toward the manor. "I think I will go in," she said. "I want to finish the Hartwell." She walked back to the house, one hand loose at her side, her face entirely composed. Inside, alone in the corridor, she pressed both hands flat against the cool wall and stood very still for a moment. She had 4 days left. The truth was coming, whether she chose it or it chose her. And the only question remaining was which would arrive first. She sat with it for 2 days. That was the hardest part. Not the encounter in the garden with Philip Crane, not the near discovery, not the half-second pause before her name. The hardest part was the 2 days after, during which she continued to be in the manor, continued to walk the grounds and read in the library and eat at the dining table by candlelight, and continued to be someone she was not, and found that it was becoming more difficult, not because the performance was harder, but because it was less necessary. She was not performing anymore, and that was the problem. On the 5th day of the extended visit, the Duke found her in the greenhouse at the rear of the property, a low glass building attached to the east wall of the garden, filled with the things that could not survive the autumn outdoors. She had found it on her 2nd morning here, wandering while the Duke was at his correspondence, and had been coming back to it each day, because something about its particular warmth, and its smell of soil and green, was deeply, privately comforting. She was standing at the central table, with a small cutting tool and a clay pot, transplanting a young herb that had outgrown its container, when she heard the door open behind her. "I wondered where you were," the Duke said. She looked up. "I hope I am not intruding." "It is a greenhouse," he said. "It is not a private room." He came in, letting the door close behind him. He looked around. She had the impression he did not come here often. The place had the feeling of something that ran on its own, tended by the gardener who also handled the grounds, without the Duke's particular oversight. He walked to the far table, where the older plants were kept in their original pots. He stopped at a compact plant, with dark leaves, and a sharp smell that cut through the general green of the room. "This is from her garden," he said. It was not a question. "The herb garden?" Mara asked. "Yes. When the season ends each year, the gardener takes cuttings and brings them in here." He looked at the plant. He did not touch it. He has done it every year since. He stopped. For several years. Mara set down her cutting tool. She She looked at the Duke standing in front of a small, dark-leafed plant in a clay pot, and she thought, "He does not come in here because he does not want to see it. He knows it is here. He approved the gardener's practice, because the gardener would have asked permission. He simply does not come." "It is rosemary," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. She let the silence be what it wanted to be. She had learned that the silence in this house was not an absence. It was where the things that could not be said out loud went to be held. After a moment, the Duke turned from the plant and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and something happened in the space between them that she had no clean word for. It was not the adjusting expression. It was not the analytical study he gave everything when he was deciding what to make of it. It was something that had given up on being analytical and become, briefly, just present. She looked away first. She picked up the cutting tool again. "I was going to finish this," she said, "before the light moves and the room goes cold." "I will leave you to it," he said. He went back to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame, the same place she had stood in Alara's doorway the morning she left the house, which she noticed and found strange. "Miss Voss," he said. "Yes?" He was looking at the door frame, not at her. "Thank you for not asking about her." She said nothing for a moment. She pressed the soil around the newly potted cutting with careful hands. "People ask too many questions about things that are not their territory," she said finally. He said nothing. He left. She heard his footsteps on the stone path, steady and measured, back toward the house. She stayed in the greenhouse until the light began to shift. She was going to tell him. She had said she would, to her father, to herself, and she was not the kind of person who moved those particular goalposts. But she had meant to tell him, at the end of the week, calmly and deliberately, in a manner that gave him the full picture at once. She had not meant for any of this to arrive at her in pieces, the way it kept arriving. The books on the desk, the candles at the dining table, the greenhouse, the rosemary plant, the 2 reading chairs. She finished transplanting the herb. She set it in the proper place. She cleaned the cutting tool and put it back in its holder. Then she went inside and wrote her 4th letter home, the one she had already drafted in advance, which now felt completely wrong when she read it back. She had written it as a report. It no longer felt like one. She crossed out the middle section and rewrote it, briefer, more careful. She said that things were progressing in an orderly way. She said she would be home in 3 days. She said Alara should continue to rest and not worry. She did not say anything else. She sealed it and gave it to Edmund, who took it without expression and sent it with the morning rider. On the 6th day, the Duke showed her the upper rooms. She had not expected this. The upper rooms were where he lived and worked in the private sense, and showing them to a guest, who was still technically a stranger, in a formal arrangement, was not standard practice. She thought he might not even have planned to do it, that it had happened the way things happen when you spend enough time with someone, not because you decided to, but because the decision had been made somewhere below the level of deciding. He took her to his study first. It was a working room, not a display room. There was a large desk covered in papers and correspondence, a map of the province mounted on one wall, with notations in the same tight handwriting as his book margins, and shelves of bound records and account books that ran the full length of one wall. "This is where most of it happens," he said. "The estate management?" she said. "All of it," he said. "Correspondence, records, the legal matters." He went to the desk and straightened a stack of papers that did not need straightening. "My father used to have 3 separate rooms for these things. I find it simpler to keep them together." "You like to see everything at once," she said. He looked at her. "You do the same in the dining room," she said. "The papers stay on the table even when you are not working. You like to be able to see the state of things without having to go looking for them." He was quiet for a moment. "I had not identified it in those terms," he said. "I think it is a very rational approach," she said. "Information that is out of sight tends to be treated as though it does not need attention." He looked at her for a longer moment than usual. Not the adjusting look, something more direct than that, something that had decided to stop adjusting and simply look. She looked back with the composure she was famous for in her own family, which was currently doing a great deal of work on her behalf. He showed her the rest of the floor, a sitting room that was plainly used and a second room that had clearly not been entered in a long time, whose door he opened only briefly and then closed again. and whose contents she did not try to see. She did not try to see. In the evening, they sat in the library again. But tonight, he brought 2 glasses of something from a bottle that he described as coming from a vineyard in the south that his father had visited once and had been ordering from ever since. He poured one for her and one for himself and set them on the low table between the 2 chairs. And they sat in the quiet, with the fire going and the light warm and even. And it was the most comfortable thing Mara had experienced, in the kind of company she was not supposed to be keeping. "You leave the day after tomorrow," he said. "Yes," she said. "And then?" he said. She looked at the fire. "And then there are conversations to be had," she said carefully. "Between families. Between the relevant parties." "I prefer to speak plainly," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you open to a continued arrangement?" he said. The room was very warm. The fire was very steady. The glass in her hand was the color of dark amber. She knew, sitting in that room, that the correct thing, the kind thing, the honest thing, was to tell him now. Not the day after tomorrow, not in 3 days. Now, tonight, in this room. She knew it the way she knew most true things, not loudly, not with argument, but with the quiet certainty of something that has been true all along, and has simply finished waiting to be acknowledged. She set down her glass. She turned toward him in the chair. "There is something I need to tell you," she said. The fire moved. The clock in the hall began to strike the hour, and each stroke fell into the room with a clean, precise sound that asked for nothing and announced everything. The Duke looked at her. That look, the last version of it she had seen before tonight, had been assessment and adjustment and recalibration. This look was something entirely different. This look was the look of a person who has already done their own calculation and has arrived somewhere unexpected and has decided to see where it leads. "Then tell me," he said. She opened her mouth. And then, from the front of the house, she heard the sound of hooves on the drive. Fast, urgent, not the measured pace of a normal arrival. The bell at the front door rang once, twice. She heard Edmund's footsteps moving quickly toward it, which was the only time she had ever heard Edmund move quickly for anything. There was a brief, urgent voice at the door that she could not make out. The Duke stood. He went to the door of the library and opened it, and she heard Edmund's precise, controlled voice say, "A rider from the Voss household, Your Grace. There has been an accident. Miss Voss's father is asking for her to return immediately." Everything in Mara went cold, and then, immediately, back to its steady temperature, because she did not have time for fear. She was already standing. She was already at the door. "I need to leave now," she said. "Edmund will arrange the carriage," the Duke said. He was looking at her with that new look again, the one that had finished adjusting and simply looked. "Miss Voss." She stopped. "Whatever you were going to tell me," he said, "it will keep." She looked at him. She did not have time to think about what was in his face. She did not have time to think about the 2 chairs, or the rosemary, or the books placed on the desk. "I will write," she said. She went upstairs. She packed her bag in 4 minutes. She came back down. The carriage was already at the door, horses stamping in the cold night, the driver wrapped against the dark. Edmund stood in the doorway with the lamp. The Duke stood beside him in the light. She did not say a formal goodbye. There was no time, and it was not, somehow, what the moment required. She looked at him once from the door, and then climbed into the carriage, and the driver turned the horses, and they moved out of the drive and into the night road. The manor lights disappeared behind her. She sat in the dark carriage and held herself very still and waited for the fear about her father to arrive, and while she waited, other things arrived first. The sound of the fire in the library, the 2 glasses, the clock striking the hour, the words, "Then tell me," said with the quiet certainty of someone who intended to hear whatever came next. She had not told him. She was going home without telling him. And the truth was still inside her, like a door that had been nearly opened and then swung shut again, and she could not decide whether that was a reprieve or the worst thing that had happened this week. The carriage drove through the dark. The fields were invisible in the night. The road was a pale thread through the black. She held her hands in her lap. She kept them still. She was always still. She had always been still. She was not sure how much longer that would be enough. Her father had not died. She established that within the first minute of arriving at the house, which was the most urgent thing, and once established, she allowed herself to breathe. He had fallen on the back steps in the dark, while going to close the garden gate. His ankle was badly turned, and his right wrist was sprained from catching himself, and he was laid out on the sitting room sofa, looking more diminished than she had ever seen him. But he was conscious, and speaking, and deeply embarrassed about both the fall and the manner in which he had summoned her home. "You sent a rider in the middle of the night," she said. "Your mother was upset," he said, which was code for, "I was upset," and would not admit it. "I was in the middle of a very important conversation," she said. Her father looked at her from the sofa. She did not elaborate, he did not ask. Clara Voss was in the doorway with a pot of tea, and an expression that managed to be both apologetic and relieved, which required considerable skill. Mara sat in the chair beside the sofa and drank the tea, and listened to her father explain, with far more detail than was needed, the exact sequence of events that had led to his falling on the back steps, and she let him explain, because explaining was how he managed the embarrassment of having needed help. Alara came downstairs an hour later in her dressing gown, assessed the situation, sat on the arm of the sofa, and said to Mara, "Did anything happen?" "Father fell," Mara said. "I mean at the manor," said Alara, with the directness of a person who was tired, and had been frightened, and was now, with the crisis resolved, returning to the thing she had been thinking about all week. Their father looked at his sprained wrist with great interest. "We talked," Mara said. "We read. We worked." "You worked," Alara repeated. "I read. He wrote letters. We happened to be in the same room." Alara looked at her sister for a long moment. "You were going to tell him," she said. "Tonight, before you were called home." Mara said nothing. "Mara," said Alara softly. "I am going to write to him," Mara said. "Tomorrow. You said you would tell him before you left." "I was pulled out of the house in the middle of the night," Mara said. "I am adjusting the plan." "You are postponing the plan," Alara said, without accusation, and without approval. Their father continued to study his wrist. Their mother refilled the teapot. Mara looked at the wall above the fireplace, where a painting of the family's original house, sold before she was born, larger and grander than anything they currently occupied, hung in its old gold frame. She had looked at that painting all her life. She had never really thought about what it meant to her father to look at it every day, the original thing always visible, always unreachable, always reminding him of the distance between what had been and what currently was. She understood, suddenly and completely, why her father was the way he was. Not as an abstract observation, as something she felt in her own chest, in a way she had not felt anything in that particular location before. "I am going to write to him tomorrow," she said again. "That is the plan. It is a good plan. It is the right plan." She stood up. "I am going to bed." She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark and thought about the library, and the two chairs, and the sound of the clock striking, and the Duke's voice saying, "Then tell me," with the patience of someone who had decided they could afford to wait, because they intended to hear what came next. She thought about the truth she was carrying. She had been carrying it for weeks now, and it had been growing heavier, not because it was getting larger, but because the space she was carrying it through had become more meaningful. A lie that lives in an empty room is a light thing. A lie that lives in a room full of candlelight and books and two chairs and a fire and a voice that says, "Then tell me," is something else entirely. She was going to tell him in a letter what she had not managed to tell him in person, and she was going to do it clearly and without softening it, and whatever happened after that would happen. She decided that. She held the decision. She fell asleep with it. In the morning, she sat at her desk before breakfast and took out her paper and ink and wrote. She had written the letter in her head a dozen times since accepting the second visit, and all those versions had been careful and structured and had laid things out in a logical order. This version, the one that actually went onto the paper, was none of those things. It was true instead, which was different. She wrote, "Your Grace, I came to your estate as Alara Voss because my family needed me to. I am her sister, Mara, 2 years younger, and we are similar enough in appearance that the plan seemed, to the people who made it, like a manageable deception. It was not manageable. It was wrong from the beginning, and it has grown more wrong with each passing day. And I am writing this, rather than saying it to your face, because the night I was called home was the night I was going to tell you in person. I did not want to write this. I wanted to tell you while sitting in the library where you left 2 chairs arranged as though someone else was coming back, and I wanted to see your face when I said it, and to be in the room with whatever came after. I am sorry that I did not manage it. I am sorry that I managed very little of this well. I owe you that truth, and I am giving it to you now, with the understanding that you are under no obligation to respond to it, and that if you choose to be angry with my family, you have every right. What I ask, the only thing I ask, is that whatever you decide it knowing who actually sat across the table from you. Her name was Mara. She was genuine in everything except her name. She folded it. She sealed it. She addressed it. She gave it to the morning rider before she could revise a single word. Then she went downstairs and ate breakfast, and helped her father adjust his position on the sofa, and did not talk about it. The letter would take a day to arrive. His response, if he chose to write one, would take another day to return. She had 2 days. She put the 2 days in front of her like a road and began to walk it. She tended the garden. She helped her mother with the household accounts, a task that was always uncomfortable given the state of those accounts, but that was practical and necessary and gave her hands something to do. She read, though less well than usual, finding herself reading the same paragraphs twice without absorbing them, and eventually giving up and going back to the Hartwell 4th volume, which she had already read twice, and which therefore required nothing of her concentration. Ilara watched her from a careful distance. She did not ask questions. She brought Mara tea at the right moments, and left it, and withdrew, which was the best version of sisterly support available to them given the circumstances. On the second day, Mara received not a letter, but a visitor. She was in the sitting room in the afternoon, when Edmund knocked at the door. Not Edmund, but a man with the same kind of face as Edmund, the face of someone who has served in a precise household long enough to have taken on its qualities. He introduced himself as a rider from Vane Manor, and said he had been instructed to wait for a reply. He had brought a letter, not a sealed one. It had been left open, which she did not initially understand, and then did. It had been left open, so she could read it in front of the rider, and send a response back with him today, without another day of waiting. He had thought of that. He had thought of the waiting. He had removed 1 full day of it by sending the letter open and the rider ready. She read it. It was short. It was precise. It was exactly what she would have expected, and nothing like what she had been fearing. He had written, I know. 2 words. Then, I have known since the 3rd day of your first visit. There was a way your left hand moved when you were listening to something that interested you. Not a gesture Ilara Voss makes, as I was able to confirm, from a brief description my solicitor extracted from mutual acquaintances without attracting notice. I continued the visits because the person who was present was worth continuing the visits for. The name on the arrangement is incorrect. The person who corrected it in writing, this morning, is not. There was 1 more line, at the bottom, in that same tight, accurate hand. If you are willing to visit again, this time as yourself, I would like that. Mara sat with the letter for a long time. She read it 3 times, not because she did not understand it, but because understanding it, and feeling it, were 2 separate processes that needed to complete at their own speeds. Then she looked at the rider, who was standing in the hallway, with the same patient expression Edmund had trained into all of them. Tell him yes, she said. The rider nodded and left. She heard the horse move down the lane. She sat in the sitting room for another minute, alone, with the open letter in her hands. He had known since the 3rd day. He had let the performance continue, not to manipulate her or to trap her, but because the person inside the performance was worth more time. He had known, and had put books on her desk, and walked with her in the garden, and sat with her by candlelight, and said then, tell me when she had finally started to reach toward the truth. He had known, and he had not said so. He had waited. Mara Voss looked at the letter. She looked at the room, at the painting of the original house in its old gold frame, at the afternoon light through the window. She folded the letter carefully. She put it in her pocket. Then she stood up, went to find her sister, and told her everything. Ilara did not say anything for a long time after Mara finished. They were sitting in Ilara's room, on opposite ends of the bed, in the same arrangement as all their serious conversations for as long as either of them could remember. The afternoon light was low and gold and very still. The novel on Alara's bedside table was open face down again, which meant she had been reading and thinking and reading again all week, the way she did when something was working its way through her. Mara had told her everything. Not the version she had told her father, practical, carefully edited, reassuring. The actual version, the library, the 2 chairs, the greenhouse and the rosemary, the dinner table and the candles, and the clock striking, the open letter, and the 2 words, and then the rest of them. Alara listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Mara finished, the room was quiet for a full minute. Then Alara said, "He knew since the 3rd day." "Yes," said Mara. "And he never, not once, said anything to you about it?" "Not until the letter." Alara was quiet for another moment. "That is the most extraordinary thing I have ever heard," she said, "from a man everyone describes as cold and direct." "He is direct," Mara said. "He is precise. He is not cold." She paused. "He chose the kind thing over the direct thing. That is not the action of a cold person." Alara looked at her with the careful expression she had been using all week, the one that had something complicated underneath it, that she was managing very deliberately. "Mara," she said. "I know," Mara said. "Do you?" "Alara." I am not saying it critically," Alara said. "I want you to understand that. I was the one who refused to go. I was the one who sat in this room and said no while you went in my place. Everything that has happened since is a direct consequence of my refusal, and I am not standing in judgment of any of it." "But," said Mara. "But I want you to be clear with yourself about what you are feeling," Alara said, "because I have watched you for the last several weeks, and I have seen you use composure, the way a person uses a coat in cold weather. Not as something true to you, but as something that keeps the cold out. And at some point, you are going to have to take it off." Mara looked at her hands. "I am going back as myself," she said. "He asked me to come as myself. That is the beginning of taking it off." Alara nodded slowly. "When will you go?" "Next week," Mara said. "I want Father's wrist to be better first. I do not want to leave while the household is unsettled." "And what does he expect from this visit?" Alara asked. Mara thought about the letter. She thought about the last line. "If you are willing to visit again, this time as yourself, I would like that." "Honesty, I think," she said. "He seems to value it." "As most people do," Alara said gently, "particularly from people who have recently not been able to give it." Mara looked up. Something in her sister's face was softer than the words. "I will be all right," Mara said. "I know you will," said Alara. "You are always all right. That is both your greatest strength and the thing I worry about most." They sat in the gold afternoon light and did not say anything for a while, which was one of the things they were best at together, being in a room without needing to fill it. Then Alara said, "What is the herb garden like?" Mara smiled, very slightly, without meaning to. She described it. The week before the 3rd visit was the strangest week of Mara's life, and it was strange in the quietest possible way. Nothing dramatic happened. Her father's wrist improved. The household accounts remained what they were. The garden dropped its last autumn leaves and stood bare and brown and waiting. She did not receive any more letters from Vane Manor, which she had not expected, and which she found, illogically, to be both understandable and somehow deeply thoughtful. He had said what he meant to say, she had replied. They were both people who did not repeat themselves unnecessarily. She read the Hartwell 5th volume, the one he had left on her desk. It was the best in the series, and she was annoyed at herself for not knowing this earlier. She also, and this required some careful interior navigation, tried to think honestly about what she wanted. Not what her family needed, not what was correct or reasonable or responsible. What she, Mara Voss, 22 years old with steady hands and a habit of composure that her sister had correctly identified as protective gear, what she actually wanted. She found that honest thinking more difficult than she had expected. She was excellent at clarity about practical things. She was excellent at understanding other people's feelings. She could read a room, a face, a silence, with a precision that had always served her well. Reading her own interior was different. It required looking directly at something she generally preferred to view sideways, at the edge of her attention, where it could not become too specific. She tried. What she found, when she looked honestly, was not a single clear thing. It was several things layered, the way geological things layer. The top layer. She wanted to go to Vane Manor. Not because she was sent there, not as a service to her family, not as a deception or a strategy. She wanted to walk through that front door as herself. That want was simple and strong, and not embarrassing, and she let it be what it was. The layer underneath. She was afraid. Not of him. She had processed the fear of him during the first visit, and it had resolved into something that was not fear at all. She was afraid of the difference between who she had been in that house and who she would be now. She had operated under the cover of another name, which had given her a strange freedom. Everything she had said and done there had been technically under Alara's account. Now it would be under her own. What she revealed would be hers. What he thought of it would be his judgment of Mara, not of some borrowed version. That was the real fear. Not him, herself. Being seen as herself and found. She did not finish the thought, because she had decided not to, and she was good at that. The deeper layer. She thought about a man who had lost something, and had quietly organized the world around its absence, keeping the garden, keeping the books, keeping the chairs. Who had spent 5 years alone in that silence, and had looked at her across a dining table in candlelight, with the expression of someone who had recently, and unexpectedly, revised something they had believed was settled. She thought about what it would mean to go back to that place, and be honest in it. She thought about it until the thinking became circular, and then she stopped thinking, and just let the week move. On Thursday, she received a short letter from Philip Crane. He was not a man of great sophistication, but he was a decent one, and the letter reflected this. He wrote that he had been thinking about the encounter in the garden, and that he wanted her to know he had said nothing to anyone about the minor confusion over names, and that he hoped the situation was resolving itself in a satisfactory manner, and that if there was anything he could do, she had only to ask. She wrote back thanking him for his discretion and his good character. She meant it. She sealed the letter, gave it to the morning rider, and thought, that could have undone everything, and it did not, because one person decided to take the kind path without being asked. She thought about the Duke, who had taken the kind path every single day for weeks without announcing it. She thought about the kind paths people took quietly, and how rarely they were noticed. On Saturday, a package arrived from Vane Manor. Not a letter. A package, carefully wrapped, with her name on it, her real name, Mara, in that tight, angular hand. She sat at the kitchen table with it for a moment before opening it. Inside was the Hartwell's 6th volume, which she had not known existed. There was no note. She held the book for a long time. She turned it over in her hands. She opened the first page and looked at the print. Her mother, who had been folding linens at the far end of the table, looked up briefly, looked at Mara's face, and looked back down at her work. "He sent you a book," her mother said. "Yes," said Mara. "A specific one." "The 6th volume of a geography series I have been reading," Mara said. "I did not know there was a 6th. "He knew you did not know," her mother said. Mara looked at the book. "Yes," she said. Her mother folded a sheet with great precision. "He is a thoughtful man," she said. "Yes," said Mara, for the 3rd time. Her mother put the sheet in the pile. She took up the next one. She said nothing else. Mara sat at the table with the 6th volume and thought about a person who had removed one day of waiting from a difficult letter by sending a rider with it already open, and who had placed 3 books on a desk before her second visit began, and who had, without any obligation to do so, continued to be considerate toward someone who had spent weeks telling him her name was something other than what it was. She thought about the word thoughtful, which her mother had used the way her mother used all words, precisely, without excess. On Monday morning, she packed her bag. Her own bag, this time, with her own things in it. 3 books, her own ink and paper, her own preferred blouse, and 2 dresses she liked. Nothing borrowed from Alara's wardrobe, nothing adjusted to be anything other than what it was. She stood at the mirror in her own room, not Alara's. Her hair was her own. The clothes were her own. The curl she had worn loose against her left cheek for weeks, she repinned, because it was not her habit. She looked at herself, plain and steady and genuinely herself, and thought, this is who is going. Ilara came to the door. She looked at Mara in the mirror. She said nothing. Mara picked up her bag. She went downstairs. Her father was off the sofa now, moving with a cane but moving, and he shook her hand at the door, and this time she saw something different in his face, alongside the relief. She saw something that was working toward being pride, though it had not yet found its full shape. Her mother pressed nothing into her hands this time. She simply held them, briefly, both of them, and then let go. Mara walked out to the carriage. She was not pretending anymore. She was not Ilara. She was not a plan, or a strategy, or a service to her family. She was 22 years old with steady hands and a habit of composure and a real name and 6 Hartwell volumes and a truth she had already given, and she was going to a house that kept things exactly as they were because it was waiting for the right reason to change them. The carriage moved. The lane went by. The bend in the road took the house. She did not look back. She faced forward, the way she did when she meant something. She was going. The road to Vane Manor was 2 days long, and she spent those 2 days differently than the previous journeys. The first visit she had spent in a kind of organized dread, running Ilara's habits through her head like lines to be memorized before a performance. The second she had spent in a more complicated state, trying to do the right thing while doing the wrong one, which produces a particular internal tension that is very tiring. This journey she spent simply thinking, not planning, not strategizing, thinking, the way you think when there is nothing left to manage. She thought about what the Duke had written, the specific words. He had not said he had tested her, or that he had known and waited for her to slip up. He had not said anything that suggested the weeks had been a game of his design. He had said, I continued the visits, because the person who was present was worth continuing the visits for. That was not the statement of someone who had been running a trap. That was the statement of someone who had made a decision, and was accountable for it. She thought about that word, worth. He had used it, without ornament, and without apology. The person was worth it. Present tense. Not was once, not seemed to be, but was. She thought about what it meant for a man of absolute precision to use a word he meant. On the second afternoon, as the carriage turned the familiar bend and the manor came into view, she felt something that was not fear, and was not relief, and was not excitement precisely. It was something that had all 3 of those as components, and was something else in its entirety. She had no word for it, and did not try to find one. Edmund came down the steps. He looked at her with the same expression as always, carefully nothing, and said, Miss Voss. My name is Mara, she said. I would appreciate it if you called me that. Edmund looked at her. Of course, he said, as though she had simply clarified a spelling. This way, Miss Mara. She followed him inside. The hall smelled the same. The silence had the same texture. The same clock ticked in the same rhythm in the corridor. But the sitting room, when Edmund showed her to it, had been rearranged. The furniture was the same, the fire was laid the same, the tea service was set as before, but the 2 chairs had been moved from their formal facing each other arrangement to something less formal, angled slightly, both toward the fire rather than toward each other, the way chairs are arranged when 2 people are going to sit and be present, without the architecture of the room telling them how to look at each other. She stood in the doorway and looked at those chairs for a moment. Then she went in and sat in the one she had sat in before. The Duke arrived 3 minutes later. He did not come from the corridor. He came from the other door, the one that connected to the study, which meant he had been working, and had not been positioned to make an entrance. His coat was the casual one, the dark gray without ceremony. His hair was slightly less ordered than it was at formal occasions. He looked at her when he came in, and she looked back at him, and for the first time since all of this had begun, she was looking at him as herself, and he was looking at her, knowing it. And the room had a quality she could not name, something that had been at an angle for weeks and had straightened. Mara, he said. Her actual name, in his voice. She had prepared, she realized, for many things about this visit. She had not prepared for her own name. Your Grace, she said. He sat in the other chair. He poured the tea himself rather than waiting for Edmund, which she suspected was a deliberate choice. He handed her cup across. Thank you for coming, he said. Thank you for asking, she said. They were both quiet for a moment. The fire moved. Outside the window, the gray afternoon sat in the old trees. I thought this would be more difficult, she said finally. The arrival, he said. All of it, she said. Being here as myself, I thought it would feel different. Does it? He said. She thought about it honestly. It feels clearer, she said, as though something is not pressing against the inside of my chest anymore. He looked at the fire. That is how it feels to stop carrying something, he said. I am told. She looked at him. I have not put things down quickly, in my experience, he said, still looking at the fire, but I have been told, by people who have, that this is how it feels. She understood what he was saying, without his having to say it differently. He was not talking about her anymore. He was describing himself, the way he occasionally did, sideways, without announcement, as though the statement had simply arrived and he saw no reason not to let it exist. It is difficult, she said, the putting down. Yes, he said. They drank their tea. The clock in the hall continued its steady, unhurried marking of the time. I read the 6th volume, she said, on the journey. He looked at her. What did you think of the northern chapter? That he was wrong about the direction of the wind, she said, and correct about everything else. Something happened in his expression. It was the thing she had been calling the adjustment, the recalibration. But this version of it was smaller and warmer than all the previous ones. Not quite a smile. Something that was in the same family as a smile, without having announced its intentions. I thought the same, he said. She looked at the fire. She was here. She was herself. The weight was gone. He poured her a second cup without asking, because he had already learned how she drank her tea, and did not require confirmation of things he already knew. There are parts of the estate I did not show you, he said. I know, she said. Would you like to see them? She thought of the closed doors on the upper floor, the music room, the curtained windows, the rooms whose furniture was covered. When you are ready to show them, she said, not before. He looked at her for a moment with the look that had finished adjusting, and simply looked. In a few days, perhaps, he said. In a few days, she agreed. And they sat in the rearranged chairs, angled toward the fire instead of toward each other, which was better, because side by side, you did not have to perform. You could simply be present, which was the thing she had been best at all along, and had been most afraid of. The afternoon moved on. Edmund appeared with a plate of biscuits that no one had asked for, set them on the low table, and withdrew, with the expression of a man who has done something for reasons entirely his own, and has no interest in discussing them. Mara ate one. It was excellent. Your cook is very good, she said. She has been here 15 years, the Duke said. She was the only member of the original household I retained. Why her? Because she did not seem frightened of me, he said, without self-consciousness, and I did not want to live in a house where the cook was frightened. Mara looked at him. Were the others frightened of you? He thought about it. I do not know, he said. I was not very good at reading it at the time. I have become better. You read people well now, she said. You read me. Not immediately, he said. It took 3 days. That is faster than most people would have managed, she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then, I paid close attention. She said nothing in response to that either. There were things that simply needed to be received and not replied to, because a reply would make them smaller. She finished her tea. The afternoon fell slowly into early evening, the light going amber and then gray at the window, and Edmund came and lit the lamps, and the manor settled into its evening rhythm around them, and neither of them suggested stopping. This was the 3rd time she had come to this house. The first time she had arrived afraid and composed. The second time she had arrived determined and careful. This time she had arrived as herself, with her own bag and her own name and her own history, and the house had not changed and the Duke had not changed, but the quality of the room had changed in a way she felt rather than saw. It was easier to breathe. That was the simplest and most accurate way she could describe it. It was easier to breathe. Later, she would think that this was the evening everything actually began. Not the deception, not the management of it, not even the letter or the response to it, but this evening, in this room, in these rearranged chairs, drinking tea and talking about a dead explorer's opinion of wind direction, while outside the old trees stood in the early dark, and the clocks kept their patient time. This was the beginning. Everything before it had been the approach. She had arrived. The second day of her 3rd visit arrived the way good mornings arrive in old houses, quietly, with light that has already been moving through the windows for some time, before anyone notices. Mara was awake before the household, which she had been on all her previous stays, because she was the kind of person whose mind returned to wakefulness ahead of necessity rather than at it. She lay in the guest room with the fire at its low morning state and listened to the house. She had become familiar with its sounds, the particular creak of the third stair when weight was placed on it, the distant rhythm of the kitchen coming to life, the way the wind moved through the chimney of the east wing, differently than through the west, a lower sound, like a voice speaking at the bottom of its range. She got up. She dressed. She went to the library. He was already there. She had expected this less than she expected most things. He had been at his correspondence on all her previous mornings, which she had understood as the fixed shape of his day, work in the morning, then the shared hours of the afternoon and evening. But here he was, in the second chair, the one beside the fire that had always been, she was now fairly certain, not his chair, with a book open on his knee and a cup of tea on the table beside him. He looked up when she came in. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She went to the shelves and pulled a book she had been looking at yesterday. She sat in the other chair, the one she had always used, which she was now certain was the one that had been his, and they read together in the early morning, without speaking, and it was the most natural thing that had happened yet. After some time, she said, without looking up from her page, "You are in my chair." A brief pause. "I am," he said. She read another line. He turned a page. "Did you do that deliberately?" she said. "Yes," he said. She thought about that. She did not ask why, because she already understood. He had sat in her chair because it was a way of saying, "I have been in this room waiting for something to sit in that chair again." He had given it to her by sitting in it, by using it, so she would take the other one. It was the most oblique and most precise gesture she had ever received from another person. She read for another 20 minutes. Then she said, "The book you chose is not what I would have selected for this early." He looked over at her volume. "What would you have selected?" "Something that does not require decisions before the second cup of tea," she said. "Your selection requires 2 major decisions in the first chapter." "And mine?" he said, nodding at his own book. "Yours is a history," she said. "You are reading about things that already happened. That requires only attention, not judgment." He looked at her. "You are correct," he said. He looked back at his book. "I have been reading histories in the mornings for years." "I know," she said. "I can see which shelves you use most frequently." The morning moved into the time when Edmund appeared with more tea and a dish of sliced fruit that no one had asked for, which Mara was beginning to understand was Edmund's way of participating in the proceedings. He could not comment, but he could bring fruit, and the fruit was always exactly what was needed. She ate a piece of pear. "Edmund likes us," she said. The Duke looked up. "He likes this," she said. "The mornings like this. He approves of them." The Duke looked at the door, through which Edmund had just departed. "He has been approving of things in silence for 30 years, he said. "I have never been certain what they were." "He approves of company," she said. "I think he has been waiting for the house to have it again." The Duke said nothing. He looked at his book. Something in his face was doing the thing it did when she said something that required internal adjustment. But this time, the adjustment was slower, and when it resolved, she thought she saw something she had not seen before in that careful face. Something that was tired, not in the bad way, but in the way of a person who has been holding something for a long time, and has recently begun to set it down. "He mentioned to me once," the Duke said, 3 years ago, that the library had the best light in the house in the morning. He mentioned it in passing, and did not repeat it. "That is very Edmund," she said. "Yes," he said. "I understood what he meant. But I had not." He stopped. He turned a page, though she suspected he had not read it. "The library was where I used to read in the evenings with my wife. I had stopped coming in the mornings because of that." Mara looked at him. He was still looking at the page. "And you came this morning," she said. "Yes," he said. She did not say anything more about it. She turned her own page, and read her next paragraph, and let the morning be what it was. They went for a walk at mid-morning, when the light was better. The grounds were in their deepest autumn state now, fully bare, the trees standing in their honest shapes without foliage to smooth their outlines. She found them more interesting without the leaves. You could see the structure of them, the way the branches had decided over decades which direction to grow, the logic of each tree's particular shape. "Do you know the names of all the trees?" she asked. "Most of them," he said. "My father had them labeled when I was young. The labels are long gone, but I remember most." "Which is oldest?" He looked along the far line of trees, and then pointed without hesitation. "The oak at the east corner. My father said it was there before the manor was built. The builders had to plan around it." She looked at the tree. It was enormous, wide and dark and absolutely certain of its own standing. "They built around it," she said, "instead of removing it. Yes, your family made a good decision," she said. He looked at the oak for a moment. "I have not always thought so," he said. "There was a period when it seemed," he paused, "inconvenient. And now?" He was quiet for a while. "Now it seems like the point," he said. She looked at the tree. She thought about that. About a thing that had been there so long, it had become the reason you built around, instead of through. They walked to the boundary wall at the far end of the grounds, where the estate ended, and the open farmland began. There was a gate in the wall, old iron, slightly rusted, that she had not seen before. "Where does that go?" she said. "To the road," he said. "There is a shorter path to the village that way." "Do you use it?" He was quiet for a beat. "I used to," he said. "Not in recent years." She looked at the gate without asking anything more. He stood beside her, also looking at it, and she understood that gates could function the same way rooms and chairs and herb gardens could function, as something kept exactly as it was because closing it properly meant making a decision that was not yet ready to be made. After a moment he reached out and opened the gate. It moved with the particular sound of old iron that has been still for a long time, not rusted shut, because someone had maintained it, but stiff with disuse. He held it open. She stepped through. He followed, and the gate swung closed behind them, with a sound like a sentence ending. They walked along the path between the wall and the hedgerow, a narrow track with the manor's trees on one side and open sky on the other, and the village visible in the middle distance as a collection of rooftops and the gray stub of a church tower. They did not go to the village. They walked the path as far as the first turn, and then came back, and the gate let them in without difficulty, and the grounds received them the way grounds receive people who belong. In the afternoon, she asked about the closed rooms. She did not plan to. It arose from a conversation about the library, about which book she had reached for next, about a series he mentioned that was kept in the upper study, and she said, "The upper rooms. You said you might show me some of them." He looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Come." He took her upstairs. He opened the east sitting room first, the one that faced south, which had been his wife's morning room. The curtains were drawn, and the room was dim and cool, and had the particular quality of a room that has been cleaned regularly but not entered, which is a very specific kind of quiet. He pulled one curtain back, and the afternoon light came in, gold and low. The room was simply furnished. A writing desk, 2 armchairs, a side table with a few books still on it, left where they had been placed. A small painting of the grounds in summer, done from inside this room looking out, which meant someone had sat in this room and looked at that view and thought it worth recording. Mara stood in the doorway. "You do not have to," she began. "I know," he said. He was standing in the center of the room, looking at the painting. "I have been in this room 3 times since Catherine died. Each time I found I was not able to do anything useful with the visit. I stood, and then I left." He looked at the painting for a moment longer. "This time, I invited someone to come with me." She stepped into the room. She stood beside him and looked at the painting. "She painted it herself," he said. "I thought so," Mara said. "The light is specific. You have to know a room well to paint its light that accurately." He looked at the painting. "She was better at several things than I understood while she was alive," he said. "That is a very common thing, I believe, to understand the measure of someone more clearly once they are gone." "It is," Mara said. "I have tried to understand it as information rather than regret," he said. "It is not always possible to maintain that distinction." She thought about what to say. She had always been good at filling silences with the right thing. Today she chose not to fill it. She let the room hold what it held. After a while he moved toward the door. She followed. He pulled the curtain back as it had been. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her briefly. "For showing you a room?" "For trusting me with it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You are easy to trust," he said. "That surprised me. At the beginning, under the circumstances, my actual character emerged, despite my best efforts to present someone else's," she said. "Yes," he said. "It did." They went back downstairs. The afternoon had moved to evening while they were up there, and Edmund had, with his silent and comprehensive sense of when things were needed, prepared the dining room with candles already burning, and a meal laid in the informal way she had come to recognize as the house's evening register. 2 settings at one end of the long table, close enough for conversation, the rest of the table bare and available, and not a statement of anything. She sat down. He sat across from her. The candles moved slightly in the air from the door, and then settled. She thought about the room upstairs, the painting, the light that someone had known well enough to record exactly. She thought about a man who had walked into that room 3 times, and each time been unable to do anything useful, and had left, and who had, on the 4th time, invited someone to come with him instead. She looked at the candles. She was not the person who had walked through that front door on her first visit, afraid and composed, and armed with someone else's name. She was not even the person of the second visit, determined and guilty, and trying to plan her way through everything. She was, tonight, at this table, something she had not been in any of these rooms before. Exactly herself, without additions or subtractions. It was a strange thing to be. She had not realized how rarely she achieved it. "You are quiet," the Duke said. "I am thinking," she said. About what? She considered telling him the whole thing. The layers, the realizations, the strange feeling of being precisely herself, and how unfamiliar it was. "About how unusual this is," she said. "To be in a place, and feel no pressure to be something other than what you are." He looked at her across the candles. "I feel it rarely," he said, "mostly when I am alone." "And now?" He was quiet for a moment. "And now?" he said. The candles burned. The house held its silence around them, the old, settled silence that had texture and weight, and had been there long enough to know when to be company. She was going to remember this dinner for a very long time. She knew that with a certainty, that did not require any future evidence to confirm it. Some things announce themselves in the moment they are happening, and this was one of them. She reached for her glass. He reached for his. Outside, the night had come fully in. Inside, the candles gave everything the same warm, impartial light. 3 days later, a letter arrived from the city. She knew, when Edmund brought it to her in the library on a gray Wednesday morning, that it was not simply correspondence. Edmund's face was carefully more neutral than usual, which she had learned to read as his version of concern. He set the letter on the table beside her, and withdrew with the particular speed of a man who does not want to be in the room when something unfolds. She looked at the envelope. The address was her father's name, redirected to her with a line in his handwriting, forwarded to Mara at Vane, as she should know this. She knew what her father meant by "as she should know this." He was saying, without saying it in more words, that the information in this letter affected the decisions currently being made in this house, and that she should have it before anything further was decided. She opened it. It was from the lending firm, not a reminder about outstanding amounts. Those had been coming for months, and she knew their shape. This was a formal notice. They had sold the debt to a third party. The debt on the Voss family home had been sold to a collecting firm whose name she did not recognize, but whose letter was written in the style of firms that did not send second notices. She read it twice. She folded it. She held it in both hands. She had come to this house as herself. She had sat in the rearranged chairs and walked through the gate in the garden wall, and stood in a room with the painting of the light, and said she felt no pressure to be other than what she was. All of that had been true. All of that had been real. And now she was holding a letter that explained why the deception had been attempted in the first place, and what it looked like when it ran out of borrowed time. She put the letter in her pocket. She did not immediately move. She sat in the library chair and looked at the fire and thought with the full clarity she was capable of when the situation required it. The situation was as follows. Her family owed money they could not repay. The entity to which they owed it had sold the debt to someone with less patience. Her father had forwarded this information to her at Vane Manor, Her father did not do things without purpose. He had forwarded it here because he wanted her to know, and he wanted her to know because he still believed, even now, after everything, even after the revelation, and the third visit, and the honest arrival, that this was information she should have while she was in proximity to the solution he had always seen this arrangement as. He still saw Aldrich Vane as a solution. She did not. That was not exactly true. She corrected herself, because she had decided to be honest with herself, and honesty required precision. She could see, clearly, that marriage to a wealthy man would resolve the financial situation. She was not so romantic or so naive that she couldn't acknowledge the arithmetic, but she could also see, with equal clarity, that using that knowledge as a reason to accelerate what was happening here, to let it push her toward an arrangement that should be arrived at freely, or not at all, would be a second deception, quieter and more corrosive than the first one. She sat with that for 15 minutes. She was still there when the Duke came to the library door. He stopped when he saw her face. She did not try to compose it. She had decided, in those 15 minutes, that she was not going to compose it. "Something has happened," he said. "A letter from home," she said. "May I speak plainly?" He came into the library and sat in his chair. "Please," he said. She took the letter from her pocket. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. "My family owes money they cannot repay," she said. "This is not new. This is what has been true for several years, and is the reason you received a letter about Ilara in the first place. What is new is that the debt has been sold to a firm that will not negotiate terms. If it is not settled, they will move against the house." He looked at her steadily. "I see," he said. "I want you to know this," she said, "because I am aware that knowing it might change your understanding of why I am here, and of what I am hoping for from being here. And I want you to have accurate information." She paused. She folded the letter back into her pocket. "I am not here because of this letter," she said. "I came on this visit because you asked me to come as myself, and I wanted to. The financial situation is its own separate disaster, and I did not know about this specific development before I arrived, and even if I had, I do not think it would have changed my decision. But I think you deserve to know it exists, because you are a person who values accurate information." He was looking at her the way he had not looked at her before, not the analysis, not the adjustment, not even the open and finished look of the recent evenings. This was something different. This was the look of a person receiving something that required no processing, that arrived already understood. "Your father sent this to you here," he said. "Yes," she said. "He wanted me to have it. I believe he hoped I would find it useful, in some way, in this context." "And do you?" "No," she said. He looked at his hands for a moment. He was quiet for long enough that she could not predict what was coming, which was a quality she had come to associate with him, the pauses that had content in them, that were doing something rather than simply being absent. "I am going to speak plainly as well," he said. "Please," she said. "Your family's financial situation," he said, "is something I was aware of before I sent the first letter. My solicitor researches the circumstances of prospective families. It is standard practice. I knew about the debts." She looked at him. "I told you this," he said, "not to explain my position, but because you have just given me information, while being fully aware that it might alter my perception of your motives, and I believe you deserve to know that it cannot, because I already had it." The fire moved. The library was very still around them. "You knew," she said. "Yes," he said. "Before the first visit." "Yes," he said. She absorbed this. She turned it carefully in her mind. "Then why?" She stopped. She found the question and asked it directly. "Why did you proceed? If you knew the arrangement was partly motivated by the financial situation, why did you send the formal introduction?" He looked at the fire, then at her. "Because a family's difficulties do not determine its members' characters," he said. "I had financial difficulties myself. In the year after my wife died, I did not manage the estate well during that time. I made poor decisions. The difficulties resolved eventually, through circumstances partly of my own making and partly of others. The experience informed me that financial hardship and moral quality are not linked in either direction." She thought about that. She thought about his annotations in the margins of books, the ones that wrote to be accurate rather than to be read, She thought about a man who had been precise about everything for so long that precision had become the primary language of his care. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that you already had all the information that everyone assumed would damage your opinion of us, and that you formed your opinion on different grounds." "Yes," he said. She held that. It was a large thing to hold. She held it carefully. "And the opinion?" she said. He looked at her across the space between the two chairs. The fire gave the room its warm and impartial light. "The opinion," he said, "is sitting in front of me." She looked at him for a long moment. She did not look away, and he did not look away, and the room held what was in it without comment. Then she said, "I should write to my father." "You should," he said. "And tell him that the information arrived safely," she said. "Yes," he said. "And that it changes nothing," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Does it not?" he said. She thought. She was honest. "It changes my understanding of the beginning," she said, "of why this was possible at all. But it does not change where we are now." He nodded slowly. "Then write to your father," he said, "and tell him that." She went to the writing desk by the window. She took out her paper and ink. She wrote a letter that was 6 sentences long, and covered all the necessary information, in the manner of a person who wrote to be accurate, rather than elaborate. She sealed it. She gave it to Edmund, who appeared in the doorway at exactly the right moment, took it without expression, and went. She came back to the chair. She picked up the book she had set aside when the first letter arrived. The Duke returned to his own reading. Outside, the gray Wednesday continued in the trees, doing what November days do, when they are not trying to be anything other than what they are. She read. He read. The fire kept its steady company. At no point did either of them suggest that what had happened this morning was not, in its own strange and honest way, the most important conversation they had yet managed. At no point did either of them need to. Her father's reply came 2 days later, and it was not what she had expected. She had expected something managed, something that arrived at what he wanted through the side door of practicality. Her father had always spoken sideways when the direct approach felt too exposed, and she had been reading his sideways speech for long enough to translate it automatically. But this letter was direct. He wrote, "I received your letter. I understand that you have told the Duke the full truth of the situation. I am writing now with the rest of the truth, which I should have told you, and did not, because I was afraid." She read the rest standing in the corridor where Edmund had handed it to her, because she had not moved to a more appropriate location. She had just opened it, and stood there with Edmund's quiet presence receding behind her, and the gray November light coming through the hall window. Her father wrote, "I borrowed more than you know. The amount you were aware of was the amount I believed was manageable. There is additional debt that I have not told your mother, which is perhaps the thing I am most ashamed of in all of this. The collecting firm that now holds the original debt also holds this second amount, and together, the two figures represent a sum that cannot be resolved by any economy or adjustment we could make from within our own resources." He wrote, "I sent you that forwarded letter because I was still thinking of you as a solution to a problem. I have been thinking of you this way since the beginning of this business, and I have told myself that I was thinking of the family, which is true, but I was not thinking of you, which is also true, and which I am not proud of." He wrote, "I am not asking you to do anything. I am telling you the truth, because you have spent months doing things that required the truth, and receiving less of it than you gave, and that is not what a father should offer a daughter. I am sorry, Mara." He signed it with his full name, which he had not done on a letter to her since she was a child, and he was signing permission slips for her school. She stood in the corridor for another full minute after reading it. Then she folded it carefully, put it in her pocket with the first letter, and stood for a moment, with her hands flat against her outer coat, the way you stand when something has arrived and you need to let it settle before you move. She found the Duke in the study. He was at his desk, and looked up when she knocked on the open door. She came in, and sat in the chair across the desk that she now thought of as hers, the guest chair, the one positioned for conversation rather than for solitary work. "Another letter," she said. "I can see that," he said. She did not give it to him to read. It was not his to read. But she told him what was in it, briefly and accurately, the way he had taught her by example, that information could be delivered. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the study was quiet. He had set down his pen when she started speaking, and he had not picked it up again. "The total amount," he said. She told him the figure her father had written. He looked at his desk for a moment. "That is manageable," he said. She looked at him. "I did not come in here to ask." "I know," he said. "I came in because I had just read something difficult, and you were the person I wanted to be in the same room with, while I processed it," she said. "That is all." He looked at her. The study was warm and ordered around them, the map on the wall, the bound records on the shelves, the correspondence organized in its careful stacks. "I understand," he said. "Good," she said. They were quiet for a moment. "Your father apologized," he said. "Yes." "That surprised you," he said. "Yes," she said. "He is not a man who does it easily." Or, he was not. "I am discovering that I may have had a partial picture of him." He said nothing immediately. Then, "Most pictures of people are partial. Even your picture of me," she said. "Even my picture of you," he agreed. "Though I believe it is more complete than most." She looked at the map on the wall. The province in its brown and green outlines, the notations in the tight handwriting. "He signed the letter with his full name," she said. "He has not done that in decades." The Duke said nothing. He looked at her with the look that was finished adjusting. "He is trying to be honest," she said. "Late, but trying." "Late honesty," the Duke said quietly, "is still honesty." She looked at him. Something in her chest did the thing it did around him, moved slightly in a direction she had stopped trying to name. "I need to go home," she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "When?" "Not today," she said. "But soon. There are things there that need to be addressed in person. Conversations that a letter cannot have." He picked up his pen. He set it down again. It was the most uncharacteristic thing she had ever seen him do. The unnecessary picking up. The unnecessary putting down. "I understand," he said. She stood. "There is something I want to say before I go home," she said. He looked up at her. "Not now," she said. "But before I leave, I want to say it properly." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "Thank you," she said. She went back to the library. She sat in her chair. She picked up her book and held it, without reading it, looking at the fire. She thought about her father's letter. She thought about the things she had told the Duke she wanted to say before she left. She was not entirely certain yet what it was, only that it was real and would require more courage than she currently had banked, and that she was going to find that courage from somewhere before the end of the week, because she had decided it. The fire burned. The house ticked around her. She opened her book. She read. On the morning she had decided would be her last, she woke before dawn and lay in the guest room, with the dark still complete outside the window, and she made a decision about the thing she wanted to say. She made it the way she made most real decisions, not by weighing things repeatedly until she was tired, but by letting the decision surface from below the level of weighing, where the actual answer had been waiting all along. She got up. She dressed. She went downstairs to the kitchen, which was warm and already occupied by the cook, a woman named Rose who was about 50, with the compact efficiency of someone who had organized the same space for 15 years and had long since perfected the arrangement. Rose looked at Mara without surprise and said, "Tea is ready, miss." "Thank you, Rose," Mara said. "I am sorry for the early hour." "The early hour suits me," Rose said, "and it has suited the master for years. You are company for it." She sat at the kitchen table with her tea. Not the formal dining room, not the library, just the kitchen table, where things were plain and practical, and the smell of wood smoke and bread was honest and domestic, in a way that required nothing. She thought about what she was going to say. She had been told, her whole life, that she was composed. Her father said it. Her mother showed it by example. Alara observed it sometimes as a quality she admired, and sometimes as a quality she worried about. Teachers and neighbors, and people who had known her since childhood said that Mara was so composed. And it was true. She was composed. But she had also spent most of her life in circumstances that required composure. A household on the edge of difficulty. Parents whose faces needed to be read before asking for things. A sister whose own feelings often occupied the room first, leaving less space for Mara's. She had learned composure, the way children learn survival skills, because the environment required it, and because she was good at it, and because it worked. She was sitting in a kitchen in a manner that was not hers, on the morning she had decided to leave it, and she was about to say something that was not composed at all. It was just true. And truth and composure were not the same thing. She had known this in her head for years, but she was understanding it now in her chest, which was slower and more reliable. She finished the tea. Rose gave her a second cup without asking. She finished that too. Then she went to find him. He was in the library. Of course he was. She had known he would be, and she had thought about finding him somewhere less significant. In the corridor, in the study, at the front door where the arrival and departure of things happened without lasting wait. But she had decided that the library was the right place. It had been the room where most of the real things had happened. It deserved to receive one more. He was in his chair, her chair, the one he had sat in on her first morning to give it to her. This morning he was back in it, which meant something she chose to let mean what it meant. She came in. She sat in her own chair, his original chair, as she was increasingly certain it had been. She looked at the fire. She said, "I do not know how to begin this." He set his book down. He gave her his full attention, which was something he gave no one casually, and which she had come to understand as the most significant thing he regularly offered. "Begin at the beginning," he said. She looked at him. "The beginning was dishonest," she said. "Begin at where it became honest, then," he said. She thought about that. She thought about when it had become honest. "The library," she said. "The first morning of the second visit, when I told you the Hartwell fourth chapter was wrong about wind direction. That was the first true thing I said in this house." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "Everything before that was performance," she said. "And everything after it was not, and I—" She stopped. She found the thing she was trying to say, and looked at it squarely. "I spent the whole first visit, and most of the second one, telling myself that this was a practical arrangement, and that I was managing it in the service of my family, and that what I was feeling in this room, and in this house, was simply the novelty of an unusual situation." She looked at the fire. "That was not accurate." He said nothing. He was very still. "What I was feeling," she said, "was specific, and it was about you. Not about the house, or the situation, or the arrangement. About you. The way you read in the mornings. The way you said things precisely. The way you put books on a desk for someone without making it into a gesture. The way you sat in my chair this morning so I would take yours." She paused. "I am telling you this because I am leaving today, and I did not want to leave without having said it plainly, as a person who is speaking for herself, and not on behalf of any other consideration." The fire moved. The clock was somewhere else in the house, and could not be heard from here. The library was completely quiet. He said, "Mara." It was only her name. But the way it arrived, with all the contained and precise weight of a man who said nothing he did not mean, and had spent 5 years learning to be careful with what he valued, because the last time he had not been careful, he had not been able to recover quickly. Her name in that voice, said in that way, was not a small thing. She looked at him. "I know," he said. "You know," she said. "I have known for some time," he said. "As you may have noticed, I am not unaware of things I pay close attention to." She almost laughed. She felt it at the edge of her expression. "You are very frustrating," she said. "Yes," he said, "I have been told." She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them was the fire, and the distance of 2 chairs, and 5 years, and several weeks of the most complicated and honest approach to another person she had ever managed. "I am going home to speak to my father," she said. "And then I am going to come back, if you want me to." "I want you to," he said, without hesitation, without qualification. She nodded. She stood. "Then I will come back," she said. She picked up her bag, which she had brought with her, because she had planned the conversation to end with the departure, not to require returning upstairs. He stood. He walked her to the front door. Edmund was already there, which meant Edmund had also planned the morning more carefully than anyone had acknowledged. The carriage was in the drive. She stood at the top of the steps and looked at the grounds in the pale November morning, the old trees, the neat hedges, the far line of the east wall, the gate in it that had recently been opened. "I will write," she said. "I know you will," he said. She walked down the steps. She got into the carriage. The driver clicked, and the horses moved. This time, as the manor disappeared behind the drive's long curve, she watched it. She let herself watch it. The wide, dark stones, the steady windows, the old oak at the east corner that the builders had been wise enough to plan around. She watched until it was gone. Then she looked at her hands. They were steady. They were always steady. But the steadiness now had something underneath it that was new. Not anxiety, not uncertainty. Something warmer than either. Something that understood where it was going. She was going home. She was going to tell her father the truth about what she had decided. She was going to be in her own house, in her own room, as herself, for however long it took to settle the things that needed settling. And then she was coming back. That was not composure speaking. That was something else. Something that had been waiting under all the composure for years and had finally, in a library in a house full of kept things, found a reason to surface. The road went on. The fields were bare and quiet in the November morning. She was going home. For the first time in a long time, she was also going somewhere. The journey home took 2 days, and she spent the first of them in a state she did not immediately recognize, and then did. Relief. Not the relief of an ordeal ending, the relief of something being named. She had said the thing in the library, and it had been received by a person who already knew it, in that particular way of his. Not because he had been waiting for it as a cue, but because he was a person who paid very close attention and had simply observed it being true before she had articulated it. She thought about that on the first day, about what it was to be seen before you had named yourself. She had spent years being good at seeing other people clearly. Elara, her father, her mother, the Duke himself, and had not given a great deal of thought to what it would feel like to be on the receiving end of that attention. Now she knew. It felt like a room that had more space in it than you expected. She arrived home, on the afternoon of the second day, when the light was low, and the garden was deep in its autumn quiet. The carriage stopped at the front gate. She climbed out. She stood on the lane for a moment and looked at the house. It was smaller than she remembered. That was the effect of having spent weeks in a manor, with wide stone halls and old high ceilings. Everything else appeared reduced. But it was also genuinely smaller than it had seemed in her childhood, and she understood, for the first time, what her father saw every day when he looked at the painting of the original house, the distance between what had been and what was now. She went inside. Her mother was in the sitting room with her mending. She looked up when Mara came through the door, took in her face, and said, "Good." That was all. Just, good. But her mother's good carried the full weight of the conversation they had not had, and did not need to have, because her mother was the most economical user of language in the house, and always had been. Her father was in his study. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She went in. He was sitting at his desk, not with his notebooks of numbers this time, but with nothing. His hands were on the desk and he was simply sitting with them there, which was a posture she had not seen him in before. He looked, for the first time in many years, like a person who was not managing something. "I received your letters," he said. "I know," she said. She sat in the chair across his desk. "I received yours." He looked at his hands. "I was honest," he said. "I was not honest earlier. I apologize." "You were honest when it became necessary," she said. "I will take that." He looked up at her. Something in his face that had been closed for a long time opened slightly, the way a room opens when the curtain is pulled back just far enough to let in light. "What happens now?" he said. "Now," she said, "I am going to tell you what I told the Duke this morning in his library." She told him. Not the details, those were private, but the shape of it. She told him that she had gone to Vane Manor as a strategy and had stayed as a person, and that the person she had stayed as was herself, and that she was not going back as a service to anyone, but as someone who had made a decision of her own and intended to act on it. Her father listened. He looked at the desk. He looked at his hands. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I arranged this because I was desperate." "I know," she said. "And it became something I did not intend," he said. "Yes," she said. "Mara," he looked at her. There was something in his face she had not seen in so long, she had forgotten it was possible there. Something that was not management, not strategy, not the careful positioning of a man who has spent years trying to hold a crumbling thing together. Something simpler and older than all of that. Are you happy? She thought about the library, the 2 chairs, the morning tea, the gate in the garden wall, the name in his voice. I think I am going to be, she said. Her father nodded slowly. Then something good has come of this, he said. Something I did not earn. You did not earn it, she agreed. But you also did not ruin it, which was not guaranteed. He almost smiled. That is true, he said. I consider it a secondary achievement. She almost smiled back. Talk to Mother, she said. About the actual figures, she should know. He looked at the desk. Yes, he said. I know. Tonight, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. Tonight, he said. She went upstairs. She knocked on Alara's door. Come in, said Alara. She came in. She sat on the end of the bed. She told her sister everything. Properly this time, without the editorial distance she had used on previous tellings. All of it. Alara listened without moving. When Mara finished, Alara looked at the ceiling for a moment and then looked at her. You said it, Alara said. In the library. Yes, said Mara. And he said he already knew. Yes. And you told him you were coming back. Yes, said Mara. Alara was quiet for a long moment. Then she made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite relief, and was something in between, that only people who know each other very well can correctly identify in each other. You have managed, Alara said, to have the most complicated version of a simple thing I have ever heard of. I know, Mara said. But it is the right thing, Alara said. She said it firmly, without qualification. Yes, said Mara, I think so. They sat in the room together, in the old comfortable way, the one that did not need words to sustain it. Outside the window, the bare garden was going dark in the early evening. Inside the house, for the first time in what felt like a long time, the particular quality of the air was different, less pressurized, less managed, less organized around avoiding the inevitable. Her father had gone to find her mother. Alara had picked up her novel and set it back down. Mara sat on the end of the bed and felt the house around her, small, worn, genuinely hers, and did not feel diminished by it for the first time she could remember. She was going back to Vane Manor. She had said so and she meant it. But she was here now. She was here, in her own house, with her own people, and the thing she had said in the library was still true, and would still be true when she returned to it, because true things did not expire when you left the room where you had stated them. He sent me a book, she said. Which book? The 6th Hartwell volume, she said. The one I did not know existed. Alara looked at her for a moment. What did it feel like to receive it? Alara asked. Mara thought about it honestly. She sat with the honest thought. Like being paid attention to, she said. Like someone had catalogued the exact shape of what I was missing and filled it. Alara looked at her with the expression that had been there since the beginning of all this. Guilt and relief, and something warmer than both. I am glad you went, she said. I am sorry it was because of me, but I am glad you went. I am glad I went too, Mara said, for entirely different reasons than the ones that sent me. She went to her own room that night. Her own room, her own bed, the window that looked out at the garden she had tended all her life, bare now in November, the soil dark and ready for spring. She lay in the dark and thought about none of the complicated things. She let the day settle. She let her father's honest letter settle. She let the library and the 2 chairs and the name in his voice settle, each of them finding their proper place in the arrangement she was assembling. She had said what she needed to say. She had heard what she needed to hear. She had a direction. She was going to deal with the immediate things here, the conversations that needed to happen, the honest accounting her father and mother needed to have, the quieter and more ordinary things that a household requires when it is in difficulty, and someone finally decides to look at the difficulty directly rather than sideways. And then she was going back. Not as Alara, not as a strategy, not as an answer to a financial problem, though the financial problem was real and would need to be addressed in its own time. As Mara, as herself, with her own bag and her own books and her own name, and her own particular way of sitting in rooms and reading people, and saying true things when they were ready to be said. She was going back because a man had placed books on her desk and opened a gate in a garden wall and rearranged the chairs and said her real name as though it were something worth saying. She was going back because she had said, "I want to come back." And he had said, "I want you to," without hesitation, without qualification. And those 4 words had been the most direct and unmanaged thing she had received in 22 years. The room was dark. The house was quiet. Her father was still awake somewhere below, and she could hear, very faintly, his voice, and her mother's moving in the way that voices move when they are finally having the conversation they should have had months ago, slowly, carefully, with pauses that were working through something rather than avoiding it. Good, she thought. She closed her eyes. She slept. The next 10 days at the Voss house were the most honest the family had been with one another in years, possibly in Mara's entire memory. And they were not easy. Honest things rarely are. Honest things require you to look at the actual shape of what is in front of you, and the actual shape of things is often less comfortable than the version you have been managing. Her father and mother talked every evening. She did not hear everything that was said. She was not supposed to, and she had too much respect for both of them to press against the closed doors she had always respected. But she heard the quality of it, which was different from the quality of their previous conversations. There was less of the delicate negotiation that their evenings had carried for years, the kind of talk that navigates around the real subject with elaborate care. There was more silence, more starting over, more of the rougher sound that conversations make when they are moving through something rather than around it. Alara spent most of the 10 days in the garden, which had become her habit in times of private processing. She turned the last of the autumn beds, pulling out the dead plants and working the soil over for the coming cold, and she did it with the same focused quiet she brought to everything she cared about. And Mara saw her from the window sometimes, and felt something she could not precisely name, something that was both love and admiration, and a kind of grief for the situation her sister had been put in, that had become something else for both of them. Mara herself wrote letters to the Duke, brief, every 2 days, with the ordinary contents of what was happening around her, the garden, the conversations, a book she was reading, a thing her father said that had made her think. Not love letters in any conventional sense. Letters that were simply what she was seeing and thinking, sent to a person she was increasingly certain wanted to know. His replies arrived with the same frequency and in the same spirit. What was happening at the manor, the boundary question that had been resolved, a passage in a book he had underlined and wanted her to read, a note that Edmund had rearranged the library. She read that last one 3 times. He had mentioned it without context or comment, the way he mentioned things he wanted her to absorb rather than immediately respond to. She understood. Edmund had rearranged the library because the library was being used differently now. Edmund approved of the change and was marking it the only way available to him. She wrote back, "Tell Edmund I appreciate it." The financial conversation with her father happened on the 4th day. She had asked for it, and he had agreed with the quiet relief of someone who has been waiting for the asking. They sat in his study in the afternoon. The closed notebook finally opened, and went through everything. It was worse than she had known. Not catastrophically beyond solving, but worse, more entangled, more layered, with the collecting firm holding multiple instruments in their name, and charging interest that was accruing monthly. Her father explained each piece with the detail of a man who had been carrying the knowledge alone for too long, and was finding the unburdening of it as painful as it was necessary. She listened without interrupting. She had a small notebook of her own, and she wrote down the numbers as he gave them, because numbers needed to be written to be thought about properly, and she wanted to think about this properly, rather than simply react to it. When he finished, she looked at her notes. "We have a few options," she said. He looked at her. "None of them are good," she said, "but they are not 0. She laid them out. The first was a direct appeal to the collecting firm for a restructured schedule. Possible, but unlikely to succeed, given that the firm had acquired the debt at a discount precisely because they expected to use the legal mechanisms available to them. The second was finding a private lender with different terms. Difficult, given their current standing, and likely to produce another version of the same problem delayed by a season. The third was what she had been thinking about since reading her father's honest letter. "The Duke's solicitor will write to the firm," she said, "if the Duke is willing, as a formal negotiation on behalf of someone in serious consideration of the Voss family, not as payment, as leverage. It changes the firm's calculation. They would rather settle for a reasonable figure than face a protracted negotiation, with someone who has the resources to make it complicated. Her father looked at her. You would ask him to do that? He said. I would explain the situation and let him decide, she said. He already knew about the debt before this began. He has been honest about that. If he is willing to help with this, and I do not know that he is, I am not assuming it, it would not be charity. It would be a person who has decided to be involved in this family's affairs acting in that capacity. Her father was quiet for a long time. Mara, he said. I know, she said. I know what it looks like, but I am not doing it for the family's sake. I am doing it because it is a practical solution to a real problem, and because if the positions were reversed, I would hope someone would do it for me. Her father looked at her. He had a particular expression she had not seen in a very long time. Not the management expression, not the strategy expression, not even the relief expression. This was something older and quieter and more fundamental. When did you become wiser than me? He said. She looked at her notebook. I think I was always the same amount of wise, she said. The circumstances made it visible. He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his pen. Write to him, he said. If you are going to ask something of someone, ask it yourself. She wrote to the Duke that evening. She explained the situation fully, not as a request, but as the information. She said, I want you to know this, not because I expect anything of you, but because I have decided to stop carrying information as though it is a burden I should manage alone. She said, if you are willing to involve your solicitor in a negotiation with the collecting firm, I believe it would resolve the situation. She said, if you are not, I understand entirely, and I will write to you tomorrow about the Hartwell 6th volume, which I have now finished. She sealed it and gave it to the morning writer and did not think about it again, because thinking about it would not make the reply arrive faster and would only make the waiting harder, and she was a practical person. She went to the garden and helped Alara with the beds. They worked side by side for 2 hours in the cold morning without speaking much. Then Alara said, You have become different. Different from what? Mara said. From the person who left here the first time, Alara said, before the first visit. Mara thought about that young woman in the borrowed dress with the curl loose against her left cheek. She was afraid, Mara said. She was very composed, Ilara said. She was also afraid. I could see both. I am still composed, Mara said. Yes, said Ilara. But the composition is yours now. It is not armor. It is just how you are. Mara pressed the soil around the base of the bush she had just cut back. She thought about what Ilara had said, the distinction between composure as protection and composure as character. You are right, she said. I did not know the difference until recently. I know, Ilara said. That is why I mention it. They worked for another hour. The garden was mostly done now for the season, put to bed in the way gardens are put to bed, not abandoned but stored, the life in it, made quiet and underground, and preparing. The Duke's reply arrived on the 6th day. She was in the sitting room with a book when the writer came, and she knew it was his reply before she opened it, because the handwriting on the outer envelope was that angular, controlled hand she could identify from across a room. She read it. He had already spoken to his solicitor. The solicitor had already written to the collecting firm. The matter would be resolved within a fortnight, with a settlement figure that the Duke had underwritten directly. He had not loaned the amount. He had settled it. There would be no repayment schedule. There would be no interest. There was simply a figure that had been owed, a conversation between solicitors, and a situation that was resolved. He had written, "This is not an arrangement. It is not a transaction. It does not require anything of you or your family. It is the action of a person who has decided that your family's well-being is not a bargaining position, and who does not want it to be treated as one by either of us." She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she went to find her father. He read the letter at his desk. He read it once, and then again, and then he set it down. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at the desk the way he had been looking at it on the day she came home, with nothing in front of him, just his own hands. He did not make it a debt, her father said finally. No, she said. He could have, her father said. Yes, she said. Her father was quiet for another moment. He looked at his hands. I misjudged him, he said. You judged him based on information that was incomplete, she said. That is not the same as misjudging. Her father looked at her. You are defending him again, he said, as you once told your sister you were not doing. She thought of the kitchen table and the first morning of the very first visit, sitting with Alara and saying, "People say many things, not all of them accurate." She had said it to be reassuring. She had not known yet whether it was true. "I am not defending him," she said. "I am describing him accurately, which is something I can now do." Her father looked at the letter. "You should go back," he said, "as soon as the family matter is settled enough to leave." "I know," she said. "Not for us," he said, "for yourself." She looked at her father. Something was different in his face. Different from the beginning. Different even from the honest letter. Different from the first night of real conversations with her mother. He looked like a person who had set something down and not yet picked anything else up, and who was beginning to find that the empty hands were lighter than he had expected. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. He picked up his pen. He opened the notebook. She went back to the sitting room. She sat with the letter. She thought about a man who had solved a problem and explicitly refused to make it a transaction. Who had written, "It does not require anything of you." Who had sent that letter knowing it would arrive in a household full of people who had been treating everything as a transaction for years, and who had deliberately written to subtract that weight. She thought about what he had not said in the letter, which was, "Come back." He had not said it because he had already said it. The reply to her first honest letter had said it. His single spoken yes in the library had said it. He did not repeat things he had already said clearly. He had simply done the thing, and left the rest where she had already placed it. She was going back on Sunday. She had decided that, before she put the letter down, she did not go find her father again to discuss it. She did not consult the situation or check whether the family would manage without her for another 10 days. She simply decided, and felt the decision as a fact rather than a question. She went upstairs to tell Alara. Alara was in her room reading, actually reading this time. She had found a new book and it was doing what a good book does when you need it, which is to simply take you somewhere else for a while. She looked up when Mara came in. Mara said, "I am leaving Sunday." Alara said, "Good." She said it with the same quality as their mother's single word on the afternoon Mara had come home. Good. Simple, final, completely sufficient. Mara sat on the end of the bed. They were quiet together for a while. "What are you reading?" Mara said. Alara held up the cover. "Is it good?" "It is deeply unrealistic," Alara said, "but it knows exactly what it is, which I find admirable." Mara smiled. Alara went back to her book. Outside the window, the garden was bare and dark and ready. The house was quiet, with the particular quiet of a place that has been through something, and has come out the other side, and is now resting in the ordinary way of things that have been resolved. Her father was in his study. Her mother was somewhere downstairs. Alara was reading. And on Sunday, Mara was going back to Vane Manor, as herself, with her own bag, and her own books, and her own name, to a house that had kept things exactly as they were, because it had been waiting for a reason to move. She was the reason. That was the most extraordinary thing she had ever known about herself. She was not a plan, or a strategy, or a service, or a deception, or a solution. She was a reason. She stayed on the end of the bed until Alara finished her chapter. Then they went down for dinner, and the family was quiet around the table, in the way families are quiet when the worst is past and the next thing has not yet begun. It was a good quiet. She spent the days before Sunday, preparing in a way that was different from every previous preparation. There had been the first preparation, running Alara's habits through her head, borrowing her clothes, constructing a version of herself that would hold up to scrutiny from a distance. There had been the second, the determination to maintain the performance while being less and less able to sustain it, the planning for an eventual truth she could not stop moving toward. The third time, she had simply packed herself and gone. This preparation was more internal than external. She was packing the same bag, the same books, the same practical arrangements. What was different was what she was carrying in her chest, which was no longer the weight of an obligation, but something that had a different quality entirely. Lighter, but more specific. The way things become when they are chosen, rather than assigned. She settled a few remaining things. She spoke to the housekeeper about the winter maintenance, because her father's wrist was still not reliable for heavy work, and her mother should not have to manage the stove alone in the cold months. She wrote 2 letters, one to a childhood friend she had been neglecting, and one to a neighbor who had asked after the family situation in a tactful and genuine way. She cleared the small accounts that she had been tracking in her own notebook and found, to her relief, that with the larger debt resolved, the remaining figures were genuinely manageable. Not comfortable, not easy, but manageable, which was an entirely different prospect. On Saturday evening, Ilara helped her pack. Not because Mara needed help, she was an extremely efficient packer and had been for years, but because it was one of the things they had always done together when one of them was going somewhere, and the ritual of it felt right. Ilara folded things precisely, the way she folded everything, and placed them with care, and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Take the blue dress." "I was not planning to bring it," Mara said. "It is too formal." "Bring it anyway," Ilara said. "There will be an occasion." Mara looked at her. Ilara met her look, with an expression of complete innocence that was entirely unconvincing. "Ilara," she said. "I have no particular thought about any particular occasion," Ilara said. "I simply think you should be prepared for ordinary occasions that are perfectly ordinary." Mara put the blue dress in the bag. They sat afterward in Ilara's room in the old arrangement, and Ilara made them both tea on the small burner she kept for late evenings, and they talked about nothing important for an hour and a half. The neighbor's dog, a book Ilara wanted to reread, a memory from when they were small that they both told differently and had never resolved, the way sisters sometimes keep the same memory in different shapes and are both correct. When Mara went to bed, she was not afraid of Sunday. This was not composure, it was something further in, something that had finished being afraid and had not found a new thing to be afraid of yet, which was not the same as confidence exactly, but was a reasonable facsimile of peace. She lay in the dark and let the night move. On Sunday morning she was up before the household again, which was its own kind of signature. She had been an early riser since childhood, because mornings were quiet, and she had always done her clearest thinking in quiet. She made her own tea in the kitchen, standing at the counter the way she sometimes did when she did not want to sit down yet, and she looked at the garden through the window. November had left it very plain. The soil was dark and ready. The bare structures of the beds were geometric and clear. She drank the tea. She looked at the garden. She thought, "I am going back." She thought it the way you think a settled thing, not with excitement or anticipation or any of the complex overlay of feelings she might have expected. Just with the clean weight of a decision made and held. Her mother came downstairs at 7:30. Ahmed Smith. She made tea without speaking, and they stood together at the kitchen counter for several minutes, in the companionable silence of two people who do not require conversation to keep each other company. Then her mother said, "The road should be clear today. No frost last night." "Good," Mara said. Her mother looked at the garden. "The beds are ready," she said. "Ilara did good work on them." "She always does," her mother said. She was quiet for a moment. "You are coming back." It was not a question. It was something between a question and a statement, the form of something that believes it knows the answer, but wants to hear it. "For visits," Mara said, "as often as possible." "That is all I asked," her mother said. She had not asked anything, but she had meant this, and Mara had understood it, and the understanding was the same as an answer. Her father came down at 8. He looked better than he had in months, not restored to the person he had been before the worst years, but rested in a way he had not been. The honest accounting, the difficult conversations, the long evenings with her mother, they had taken something from him that had simultaneously been supporting him, the way a weight can do both things. He was lighter. He was also unsteady without the weight, and finding his balance, and this was a thing that would take time, and was the right problem to have. He shook her hand at the front door. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had seen on the evening he had said, "When did you become wiser than me?" "Right," he said. "Frequently," she said. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say more, and was working through whether the more was necessary, or whether it would only make the departure longer, and not better. He chose to let it be. That was wisdom. She recognized it. Ilara came out in her coat, which meant she was going to stand at the gate, the way she had not done on any of the previous departures. Mara looked at her. Ilara looked back. "The blue dress will be appropriate," Elara said. I am confident. You know nothing, Mara said. I know everything, Elara said. I have always known everything. You simply do not tell me things. I just told you everything, Mara said. You told me recently, Elara said. That is different from always. Mara picked up her bag. The carriage was in the lane. The driver was in the box, patient, warm-breathed horses stamping softly in the November cold. She walked out through the gate. Elara stood at it. Their mother stood at the door. Her father stood behind their mother with his hand on her shoulder, which was a thing he had not done in front of them in years, and which meant more in its quiet ordinariness than any gesture he had deliberately made. Mara put her bag in the carriage. She turned back. She looked at the house. The small house, with its worn walls and its bare garden and its painting on the dining room wall of the original thing, her father's fraying cuffs and her mother's lavender handkerchief and Elara's novels face down, and the accounts that had never added up. She looked at all of it and felt it as hers, completely and without qualification. Then she got in the carriage. The driver clicked, the horses moved, the lane went by. She did not look back this time either. Not because she could not bear it, but because she did not need to. It was in her. It was not something she left behind. The road opened ahead, the fields in their November state, bare and brown and waiting. The sky was the color of pewter, flat and even, the same sky she had driven under on the very first journey, the one made in borrowed clothes with a borrowed name. She was in her own clothes. She was carrying her own name. She was going to a house where both of those facts were known and welcomed. She looked at the road, she looked at the fields, she looked at the sky. She thought about the two chairs, rearranged to face the fire, instead of each other. She thought about the 6th Hartwell volume, and the books, placed on the desk, and the gate in the garden wall opened after years, and the words said without hesitation, I want you to. She thought about all the things that had been kept exactly in place, waiting for the right reason to move. She thought, I am the reason things are moving now. That was not arrogance. It was simply the truth, which was the thing she had always been best at when she allowed herself to have it. The carriage moved through the November morning. The horses were steady. The road was clear. She was going back. Vane Manor, in the deep of November, looked different from every previous arrival. The first time she had come, it was autumn's middle. Warm cold, still colored, still holding its leaves. The second visit, it was deeper in the season, the grounds beginning to let go. Now it was fully November, the trees bare and the stone darker than usual, from 2 days of rain, the paths clean and wet shining, and the manor itself standing against a sky that had committed fully to winter gray. She came around the bend in the drive and saw it, and she felt something she had not felt on any previous arrival. It felt like coming back, not like a return to a place she had been before, which was what returning felt like in her ordinary experience. Something more specific than that. It felt like the place had been expecting her, and the approach confirmed an arrangement that was already in place. She knew this was partly in her own perception. Places did not expect people, but people could expect each other, and what she was reading in the feeling was not the manor's expectation but the Duke's. The person inside it, who had been corresponding with her for 10 days, who had answered her letters the same day they arrived, who had resolved a financial situation with the kind of matter-of-fact generosity that did not require gratitude and had asked for none. Edmund came down the steps. He saw her. He said, Miss Mara. He had been doing this since she had asked him to, on her first official visit as herself. He had adopted it without delay and had been doing it ever since, with the same precision he brought to everything. But today there was something fractionally different in how he said it. Not warmer exactly. Edmund did not do warm, but with a quality she could only describe as settled, as though things had arrived where he had expected them to arrive, and he had been quietly certain they would, and here they were. Edmund, she said, you rearranged the library. He took her bag. The arrangement is more practical now, he said. More practical for whom? She said. For the current use of the room, he said. He went up the steps. She followed, smiling at the back of his head. The Duke was in the library. He was not pretending to be there for other reasons. He was simply there, standing near the fireplace, which was already lit, and he turned, when she came in, with the particular turning of someone who was not startled, because they had been listening for the arrival. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You are here," he said. "I am here," she said. She looked at the room. Edmund had rearranged it. The two chairs were closer now, angled not just toward the fire but toward each other as well, which was different from the formal facing each other arrangement of the first visit, and different from the angled at the fire arrangement of her honest third arrival. This was both, somehow. It acknowledged that two people were going to be in this room together and had stopped pretending that this was incidental. "He is very direct," she said, nodding at the chairs. "He always has been," the Duke said. "I simply did not give him occasion to express it." She went to her chair, the original one, his, the one that had been returned to her. She sat. He sat in the other. The fire was between them, and they were close enough that the warmth of it was shared. Edmund appeared with tea. He did not knock or announce himself. He set it on the low table, looked at the room with the expression of someone checking that a calculation has come out correctly, and left. "He is pleased," she said. "He did not show it," the Duke said. "He showed it in the way he shows things," she said. "He straightened the tray before he left. He only straightens things when he approves of the situation." The Duke looked at the door through which Edmund had departed. Something that had been learning to happen in his face, the thing that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family, arrived more fully than it had before. Not a smile, exactly, but something that had decided to acknowledge its own existence. "I should have noticed that years ago," he said. "You were busy," she said. "I was not busy," he said. "I was closed." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. The admission sat in the room as simply as everything he said, without drama, without the weight of something that required courage, though it had. It simply arrived. "Not entirely closed," she said. "You kept Edmund, and Rose, and the gardener." "3 people in a house this size," he said. "3 people in a house this size," he said. And stayed. He was quiet for a moment. "I had not thought of it in those terms," he said. "Edmund approved of you from the beginning," she said. "He simply did not have an occasion to express it until recently." He looked at the fire. He looked at her. "You have been here 20 minutes," he said. "I know," she said. "You have already reorganized my understanding of my own household." "I am observant," she said. "You knew that from the beginning." "From the 3rd day," he said, which meant something specific and did not require unpacking. She drank her tea. He drank his. The fire was very good. The room was the right temperature, and the chairs were the right distance, and the light coming through the window behind them was the gray November light that was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but was very honest about what it was. She was going to be here for the week. She had packed enough for longer. Just the practical acknowledgement that weeks sometimes extended themselves when the reason to leave them was not pressing. But she had planned for a week, and she was going to hold to that plan, with the relaxed grip of someone who was comfortable with what was in front of them. She asked about the manor. He told her, in his precise way, the state of things. The east boundary resolved, the winter preparations complete, a tree in the garden that the gardener had flagged as needing attention in the spring. Small things, the ordinary business of a place that was running well. She told him about home, the garden beds, Ilara's good work, her father's improving wrist and improving character, her mother's quiet productivity. She did not elaborate or sentimentalize. She reported, the way you report to someone who wants to know things accurately, rather than decoratively. He listened with the same attention he gave everything, complete, unhurried, as though what she was saying was interesting, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was hers. In the afternoon, they walked. The grounds were wet from the recent rain, and the paths were soft but not impassable, and she wore the sensible boots she had packed, precisely because she had learned in previous visits that the Duke did not plan walks. He simply went outside when the weather suggested it was possible, and she had decided to be ready. The herb garden was covered for the winter. She could see the careful work, the plants protected, the beds edged, the structure maintained. She stood at the edge of it for a moment. Rose uses most of it, the Duke said. She cuts what she needs through the season. The gardener handles the winter preparation. It is well managed, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I looked at it properly this summer, he said. For the first time since Catherine planted it, I found I could. She did not say, because of me. It would have been smaller than the truth, and he had not said it himself for the same reason, because the truth was larger than any single cause. He had been able to look at it because 5 years had passed, and grief had done what grief does when you allow it to. Not diminish, but settle. Move into a different register. Become something that is part of you, rather than something that is happening to you. She had been part of what made that possible. But she had not been the whole of it. She knew that, and was comfortable with knowing it. They walked to the east wall. The gate was closed but not locked. He opened it, and they walked the path as they had before, to the first turn, and then back. And the village was a smear of rooftops in the distance, and the sky was its steady pewter, and the air smelled of wet stone and November. I thought about this path when I was home, she said. The path specifically, he said. The gate, she said, the way it sounded when you opened it. He was quiet as they walked. It had not been opened in 2 years, he said. I suspected it was longer, she said. 2 years, he said. I walked to the village 2 years ago, for reasons I no longer remember clearly. After that I stopped. And you opened it for me, she said. I opened it while you were standing next to it, he said. There is a distinction. She looked at him. Is there? He looked at her. Probably not, he said. She looked at the path ahead of them. She felt, in that moment, the full weight of what had been built over the past months. Not the deception and its unwinding. Not the letters and the managed visits and the planned conversations, but something more basic and less manageable than any of that. Something that had not been planned and could not have been. That had arrived in rooms and at library shelves and over teacups, and in the specific quality of a silence that chose to include another person. He said nothing for a moment. They walked. The path curved slightly and straightened. So am I, he said. They returned to the manor in the early evening. The lights were already burning in the lower windows. Rose had prepared the dining room in the now familiar informal way, 2 settings at one end of the long table, candles lit. Edmund appeared with a bottle he set on the table with the brevity of a person who has decided something is appropriate and does not require discussion of the decision. They sat down. She looked across the table at him. He looked at her. She thought about the first dinner here, when she had arrived in borrowed clothes with her sister's name, and had looked at this man across a formal table, and felt a pull she had not had a word for. She had no word for it then, because she had no space in her mind for it. It was too inconvenient, too off-plan, too much a complication of an already complicated situation. She had words for it now. She had several words for it, and they were all accurate, and she was comfortable having them. You are thinking something, he said. I frequently am, she said. Something specific, he said. She looked at him. I was thinking about the first dinner, she said. In this room, with the formal arrangement. When I thought you were what everyone said you were. And now, he said. Now I think you are approximately the opposite of what everyone says you were, she said, which is consistent with most reputations when examined closely. He looked at his glass. My reputation was not entirely unfounded, he said. I dismissed my household without sufficient care for what followed. I have thought about that. You gave them references and wages, she said. I gave them the minimum appropriate, he said. I did not give them consideration. I was not considerate in those years. I was functional. She looked at him. You became different, she said. I became slower, he said, which is not the same as better, but it has had better results. She thought about that, about a man who had decided, somewhere in 5 years of solitude, to slow down. Not because slowing down was a virtue he had always held, but because speed had cost him things he had not yet finished accounting for. I am not slow, she said. I tend to see things quickly and act on what I see. I know, he said. That may be a friction, she said. It may be, he said. Or it may be the thing that moves us past the places where I would otherwise stop. She looked at him. He had said us. Without positioning it, without qualification, just us. The way a person uses a word they have already decided on. She picked up her glass. He picked up his. Edmund's choice, she said. Edmund's choice is always correct, he said. He knew that about himself long before you did, she said. Something in the Duke's face did the thing it did. The not-quite smile. The thing in the same family. Yes, he said. He did. They ate. They talked about books and the boundary question and the state of the winter road and the difference between the 5th and 6th Hartwell volumes. They disagreed about the explorer's conclusions and agreed about his methods, which was the right direction for a disagreement to go. Outside the long windows of the dining room, the November night settled into full darkness. Inside, the candles burned at one end of a table that was large enough for many more people and chose not to comment on its own capacity. The fire in the dining room grate held its warm and steady ground. The clock in the hall kept its unhurried time. She thought, at one point, about all the versions of this room she had sat in, the formal first visit, the working evenings of the second, the candlelit dinners of the third. Each time the room had been the same room. Each time the person across the table had been the same person. What had changed was the quality of the air between them, which had started as performance and ceremony, and managed distance, and had moved, through a series of honest conversations, and borrowed silences, and a gate opened after 2 years of being closed, to something that had no performance in it at all. She was sitting across a table from a man who had been described to her as cold and feared, and she was entirely comfortable. And the comfort was not the comfort of familiarity alone, but of something more fundamental. The comfort of a place that had been decided on, that did not require justification or assessment, that simply was. The evening went on. Edmund cleared the table at the right moment and retreated to his own quarters, which were in the east wing, and from which he would not emerge again until morning, but whose proximity gave the house a kind of contained companionship, the knowledge that someone was there, quietly, not intruding, simply present. She and the Duke moved to the sitting room, where the fire was better, and the chairs were the arrangement she now thought of as theirs, angled toward each other, and toward the warmth, acknowledging both the room and the person in it. They talked until late, not about anything important, about the 6th Hartwell volume and what she thought of the conclusions, about the history he had been reading before she arrived, which was about a land dispute 4 centuries ago that had remarkably consistent parallels with his recent boundary matter, about whether Edmund's tendency to bring things unprompted was a sign of mind reading or simply very thorough observation of patterns. Both, she said. He reads patterns until they become predictive. Like you, he said. Like both of us, she said. He looked at the fire. Yes, he said. Like both of us. She stayed until the fire was low and the hour was late, and then she went upstairs to the guest room and stood for a moment in the doorway, looking at the room that had been prepared the same way every time. Fresh linens, the lamp on the writing desk, the fire small but present. She thought, this room has been mine since the first time I came to it. She thought, everything in this house has been rearranging itself toward this since the beginning. She went to bed. The manor was quiet around her, the particular quiet she had learned, textured, old, inhabited in the fullest sense. She was asleep within minutes. She slept well. The week moved with the quality that good weeks have, not quickly, not slowly, but with the sense of each day being used fully while it was happening. She read in the mornings. He worked. They walked in the afternoons when the weather permitted, and when it did not, they stayed inside and found themselves in different rooms that gradually consolidated into the same one. In the evenings they had dinner and talked, and the talking became the thing they both expected from the day, the way you expect a meal, or the evening light, as the reliable part of the structure. On the third day, he showed her the last of the closed rooms. She had not asked about it again. She had understood, since the music room, that he would open things when he was ready for them to be open, and that the readiness would not be announced. It would simply appear, the way he appeared at her in her chair on Sunday morning, already there. It was a room at the end of the upper corridor, smaller than the others. He opened the door and stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, and she stood beside him and looked. It had been a nursery. It had not been emptied. The small furniture was there, a bed, with its coverlet folded precisely, as though someone had made it carefully, and then not returned to unmake it. A wooden toy on the shelf, a lamp with a painted shade. The window faced the same direction as the east sitting room, the same light at the same angle. He said nothing. She said nothing. They stood in the doorway. After a moment he stepped in. He went to the shelf. He stood before it for a moment, and then he picked up the wooden toy, A carved horse, simple, well made, clearly handled carefully before it was placed there, and turned it in his hands once. Then he set it back. He turned. He came back to the doorway where she was standing. She looked at him. He was born and died in the same week, the Duke said. You know that. I told you earlier it was a fever. That is what it was. There was very little time, and then there was no time. Yes, she said. I kept the room, because I was not ready to do anything with it, he said. That was the first year. Then it became habit. Then habit became something else. A kind of honesty, she said. He looked at her. Keeping it is honest, she said. It says, this happened. It says, I am not pretending it did not. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the room. I would like to change it, he said. Not remove what was here, but make it into something that is used. Something that is for something. She said nothing. Not immediately, he said. No, she said. Not immediately. He pulled the door closed. Not locked, just closed. The way you close something that does not need to be open right now but is available when it does. They went downstairs. She went to the library. He went to his study. They did not speak about the nursery again that day, not because it was too difficult, but because they were both people who understood that things needed to settle at their own speed, and that the most respectful thing you could do for a thing that had just been shown to you was to hold it carefully and not immediately ask it to be more than what it was. On the 5th day, Edmund did something she did not expect. She was in the kitchen early, the way she had been on her last Sunday at home, standing at the counter with her tea and looking out the window at the gray morning. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, and then he came in, which was unusual. Edmund inhabited the functional spaces of the house invisibly, arriving with things and then departing, and she had rarely seen him simply enter a room. He came to the counter. He stood beside her in the way that Edmund stood, precisely, at a considered distance, with his hands at his sides. He said, I have worked in this house for 30 years. She looked at him. The Duke engaged me when he was 11 years old, Edmund said, when his father was still alive and the household was larger. I was engaged as a junior staff member and have been here since. He looked at the window. I stayed through the years that were difficult. I considered leaving once. When? She said. After the dismissal, he said, when he sent the others. I considered leaving in protest on their behalf, which would have been a principled action and also a foolish one, because they were already gone, and his response to protest would have been to accept the resignation. I decided to stay. She waited. I stayed because I believed things would improve, he said. That is an optimistic position, and I am not by nature an optimistic person, but I had worked for him for 16 years by then, and I had formed a view. What was the view? She said. Edmund was quiet for a moment. That he was a better person than he knew how to be, he said, and that the right circumstances would show it. She looked at him. I mention this, he said, because I would like you to know that I have been waiting for this specific improvement for a very long time. I consider it validating. She looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, Edmund, she said. You are welcome, he said. He straightened a dish that did not need straightening. He went back out. She stood at the counter with her tea and let the morning be what it was, which was extraordinary and simple at the same time, the way most true things are. On the 6th day, the Duke asked her something. They were in the library in the afternoon, in their chairs, with books they were not reading, which had become a particular version of their time together. Books as occupation for the hands, while the rest of them was simply present. She had finished the 6th Hartwell and moved on to one of the histories he had recommended from the East Shelf, and he was in the middle of a volume on land management that he had mentioned in passing was simultaneously necessary and terrible. He set it down. She did not look up immediately. He said, I want to ask you something. She set her book down. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. He was thinking. She could read his particular kind of thinking now, the quality of stillness it produced, the slightly different way his hands rested. He was not uncertain, exactly. He was precise about something that was large. Ask, she said. He looked at her. I want to ask you, he said, what you see when you think about this house in 10 years. She looked at him. She thought about the question, which was large but specific. which was how he asked things. She said, "I see the library arranged the way Edmund has arranged it. I see the herb garden still growing. I see the nursery changed into something used. I see the gate in the east wall opened frequently." She paused. "I see you in one of these chairs." She paused. "I see myself in the other," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The fire moved. The library held its old, book-smelling quiet around them. "I want that," he said. "I know," she said. "I want it to be a choice you make," he said. "Not a conclusion you arrive at. Not a result of accumulated circumstances. A choice." She looked at him. "It is a choice," she said. "It has been a choice since the third visit, when I came back as myself. Every day since then has been a choice." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want to make it formal." She looked at the fire. She thought about the blue dress Ilara had packed. She thought about, "There will be an occasion." "When you are ready," she said. "I am ready now," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her, with the look that had finished adjusting, that had been past adjustment for some time, and was simply, completely, the look of one person looking at another person, as the specific individual they had decided on. "Then we are both ready," she said. He was quiet. The fire moved. Outside the window, the November afternoon was beginning to go dark. "I will speak to your father," he said. "Yes," she said. "He will be glad to hear from you." "I imagine he will be," the Duke said, with a quality in his voice that was not quite dry, and not quite warm, and was something in between, that she had come to understand, as his version of humor. "Edmund will also be glad," she said. "Edmund is never glad," the Duke said. "Edmund approves. They are different." "He told me this morning that this was a long-awaited improvement," she said. The Duke looked at the door. Something happened in his face. The not-quite smile arrived, and this time went a little further than it had before, which was not quite a smile, but was within reaching distance of one. "I will tell him he was right," the Duke said. "He already knows," she said. They sat for a moment in the comfortable quiet. She thought about the last several months, the letter on the breakfast table with the wolf seal, the borrowed dress, the borrowed name, the library with its 2 chairs, the gate in the wall, the honest letters, the morning in the kitchen at home, when she had made her decision, and faced forward. She thought about the herb garden, and the nursery, and the long table with one end set, and the town's gate opened after 2 years. She thought about a man who had been called cold and feared, and was precise and considered and careful, in the way that things become careful when they have been broken and put back, and are afraid of the same thing happening again, and who had kept things exactly as they were because moving them required a reason, and had found one. She thought about herself, about the steadiness that was not armor anymore, but just her own particular way of being, and about the composure that had always been hers, even when she was using it to hold things at bay, and about the truth she had finally managed to give, and the way it had been received, and about being seen before she had named herself. She thought, "I am going to live in this house." She thought, "The nursery will become something used." She thought, "Edmund will be insufferably satisfied." She looked at the fire. She looked at the man across it. "The 7th Hartwell volume," she said. He looked at her. "Does it exist?" she said. He was quiet for a beat. "It does," he said. "The explorer wrote it in his final years. It is not as good as the others. He was too old to travel and spent most of it describing his house." "I want to read it," she said. "It is in the east shelf," he said. "3rd row, far right." She stood. She went to the east shelf. She found the 7th volume, took it down, held it. The spine was pale. He had read it. She came back to her chair. She opened the book. He picked up his own. The library settled into its evening quiet. Edmund would bring something shortly, tea, or a small plate of something, or simply the lamp adjusted to the right height, whatever the room required, and Edmund had already decided it required. Outside, the November dark was complete. The old trees stood in it without complaint. Inside, the fire burned. The clocks kept their careful time. The 2 chairs were occupied. The house was in order. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. The letter from the Duke reached the Voss household on a Thursday morning. Her father was at his desk when it arrived. Not with a notebook full of numbers this time, but with the household correspondence. The ordinary, manageable, day-to-day correspondence of a household that had stopped pretending its situation was temporary and had begun addressing what was actually in front of it. He recognized the handwriting on the envelope before he opened it. He sat for a moment with it in his hands. Then he called for Clara. She came, and he handed her the letter without opening it, because he understood that this particular letter was not something he should read first alone. She opened it. She read it. She handed it back. She looked at him. They were quiet for a long moment. Then his wife said, "She chose him." "Yes," he said. "Not us," she said. It was not an accusation. It was the precision of a woman who understood the distinction and believed it should be stated. "No," he said, "not us." Clara looked at the letter in his hands. "Good," she said. He read the letter. It was short, direct, and entirely what he should have expected from a man who communicated in the language of facts rather than sentiments. The Duke had written to inform him that he intended to ask for Mara's hand in the formal manner, and wished to have George Voss's blessing before he did so. He acknowledged that the original arrangement had been conducted under irregular circumstances, for which he did not assign blame but wished to acknowledge plainly. He expressed the view that what had developed between them had done so without the assistance of any arrangement, and was the better for it. He requested a meeting at the Voss household in the coming week, at whatever time was convenient. He signed it with his full name and title. George Voss set the letter on his desk. He looked at his hands. They were, he noticed, not steady in the way Mara's were always steady, but they were not trembling either. They were simply the hands of a man who was arriving at something he had been approaching for months, from the wrong direction, and had only recently turned around. He wrote back that afternoon. He said that the following Tuesday was convenient. He said he was glad of the meeting. He said nothing about the original arrangement, or the irregular circumstances, or any of the complicated middle ground of the past months, because the Duke had addressed all of it in one sentence, and there was nothing useful to add. He gave the letter to the writer. He went to find Alara. Alara was in the garden. She was not working today. She was simply walking, which she did sometimes, when something was working its way through her. He fell into step beside her, and they walked in the bare November garden, and he said, "He wrote to me. He is coming Tuesday." Alara kept walking. "She will be glad," she said. "It is what she would have wanted," her father said. "It is what she chose," Alara said, "which is different." He looked at his daughter. He had always understood Alara as the feeling one, the one whose emotional landscape was vivid and sometimes inconvenient, and Mara as the practical one, the steady one. He was understanding, several months too late, that this division had been a failure of his perception, rather than an accurate map of his daughter's. "You are right," he said. They walked. "She will live there," Alara said. "At the manor." "Yes," he said. "Not far," she said. 2 days' ride." "No," he said. "Not far." Alara stopped walking. She looked at the garden, the bare beds, the structure of the thing without its covering, the shape of all the decisions that had been made over years about what went where, and what was worth keeping, and what could be let go. "She is going to be very happy," Alara said. Her father looked at the garden too. "I think so," he said. "She deserves it," Alara said. "She has been very careful with everything, for a very long time." He was quiet for a moment. "She has," he said. "I think," Alara said, looking at the beds, "that she will stop being quite so careful now that there is someone who does not require it of her." Her father said nothing. There was nothing to say to that was adequate. They walked back to the house. On Tuesday, the Duke arrived at the Voss household at 10 in the morning. He came in a carriage, with Edmund, who sat in the box with the composure of a man attending an event he has been expecting and has already decided will satisfy him. The carriage was not particularly grand. It was a working carriage, good quality, maintained with care rather than display, which was consistent with everything Mara had told them about the man inside it. He knocked at the front door himself, which he did not have to do. Edmund would have done it, but which, Alara told Mara later in a letter, seemed like a deliberate thing, the action of someone who understood that coming to someone's home for this particular purpose was something you did yourself. Clara opened the door. She looked at him. He looked at her. He said, "Mrs. Voss, thank you for having me." She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she said, "Thank you for coming," and stepped back to let him in. George Voss met him in the study. Ilara had disappeared to her room, which was the right decision, and Clara had gone to the kitchen to find things to do that did not need doing. The house had the particular quality of a house, where everyone is concentrating very hard on being in a different room. They sat. George offered tea. The Duke accepted it. He said, without preliminary, "I would like to have your blessing." George Voss looked at this man, at the scar along his jaw, and the controlled posture, and the hands that were still on the arms of the chair, not restless, not performing. He thought about what Mara had told him, not cold, careful, in the way of something broken and put back together that is afraid of the same thing happening again. He thought about the letter that had resolved the financial situation with a single quiet action. He thought about the books placed on a desk. He thought about a man who had known from the third day and had chosen to keep knowing quietly until the person carrying the wrong name was ready to give it up. "You have it," George Voss said. The Duke nodded once. "She chose you," George said. "Without any remaining obligation to us. She made a decision." "I know," the Duke said. "I want you to know that I know the difference," George said, "between a daughter who goes somewhere because her family needs her to, and a daughter who goes back because she has decided." "She went back." 3 times, the Duke said. 3 times, George agreed. "And each time further in." The Duke said nothing for a moment. Then, "I intend to give her every reason to find it worth being in." George Voss looked at him. This was the most direct sentence he had ever received about his daughter from anyone, and it arrived with the quiet certainty of a man who did not say things he did not mean. "I believe you," he said. They drank their tea. Clara appeared at a certain point with additional biscuits that Rose at the manor would have approved of, and Edmund appeared briefly at the doorway to say something to the Duke about the carriage that did not require saying, which Ilara later told Mara was Edmund's way of seeing the study for himself and forming his own assessment, which had apparently satisfied him. The Duke stayed for 2 hours. He spoke to Ilara before he left. Mara had not told her much about what to expect from him, only the essentials, careful, precise, not what the stories said. So Ilara went into the meeting with open hands, which was her best mode. He spoke to her with the same directness he gave everyone. He said he was aware that the original scheme had placed her in a situation she had not asked for, and that he did not wish there to be unaddressed weight between them. Ilara, who had been preparing various responses for this conversation since Mara had first told her everything, found that all of them were unnecessary. She said, "My sister is the person you want. She is also the person you are getting. I find that very satisfying, and I do not require anything beyond it." He looked at her. He said, "You are like her." "We are different in most ways," Ilara said, "but we share certain things." "The directness," he said. "The honesty," she said. "We were raised with it. We have not always practiced it perfectly, but we value it." He nodded. He left. Edmund, from the carriage box, looked at the Voss house once, as the carriage moved away. His expression, Ilara reported to Mara in her letter, was the most satisfied she had seen on a human face that week. The following Sunday, Mara went back to Vane Manor. She had been there only 10 days ago. She knew what the journey felt like, and what the arrival felt like, and what the house smelled like, and how the silence in it had texture and weight. She knew which stair creaked, and how Edmund moved, and what Rose's biscuits tasted like, and where the best light was in the library in the morning. She knew the 7th Hartwell volume was on the 3rd row of the east shelf, and was not as good as the others, because the Explorer was too old to travel. She knew the herb garden was covered for the winter, and the gate in the east wall opened after a long time, with a particular sound, and the nursery was going to become something different in the spring. She knew the house. She was going to make it hers, not instead of his, alongside. That was the difference. The carriage came around the bend in the drive, and the manor appeared against the December sky, which was lighter than November, with a particular quality of winter light that was very clean and very clear, and lit things as they were, rather than as they could be arranged to appear. The manor was wide and old and dark-stoned and absolutely still, and the grounds were neat, and the old trees stood in their honest winter shapes, and the lights in the lower windows were already burning. She was not arriving as a Lara. She was not arriving as a plan, or a service, or a stratagem. She was arriving as herself, with her own bag, and her own books, and her own name, and a decision she had made so many times by now that it was simply a fact about who she was. She was the person who came here. Edmund came down the steps. "Miss Mara," he said. "Edmund," she said. She looked at his face. "My father tells me you satisfied yourself about the study." Something moved in Edmund's expression. It was extremely small. "I verified the condition of a household matter," he said. "Of course you did," she said. She went up the steps. She went through the front door and into the hall, with its old settled silence and its clock ticking in the corridor. The Duke came out of the library. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You are here," he said, as he had said before, as he would probably say every time, because it was his way of saying, "I notice. I am present. This is significant." "I am here," she said. She set her bag down. She looked at him across the hall, with the winter light coming through the tall windows, and the fire burning somewhere in the rooms beyond, and the house around them, holding what it held. She thought about the first moment she had stood in this hall, months ago, with her heart doing something she was ignoring, and her hands absolutely steady, and the sound of his measured footsteps coming toward her down the corridor. She had thought then, "He is coming." She had been afraid, and composed, and carrying a name that was not hers. She was not afraid now. She was not particularly composed, in the sense of using composure as a cover. She was simply herself, which happened to be a calm and steady person most of the time, because that was genuinely who she was. She was carrying her own name. She had given him the truth in pieces, and then all at once, and he had received it the way he received everything, completely, without waste. She thought about all the things that had moved over the past months. The gate opened. The chairs rearranged. The room upstairs shown to another person for the first time. The long table with its single end in use beginning, slowly, to be used differently. Edmund straightening trays to express satisfaction. She thought about the thing that moved when she was in this house, which was herself. The version of herself that was not managing anything, not performing anything, not carrying anyone else's name or fulfilling anyone else's need. Just Mara, in a library, reading a book and telling a man that he was wrong about the wind direction in the 4th Hartwell volume. The most honest thing she had ever done was walk back through that door as herself. Everything since then had been the consequence of that honesty, and the consequences had been the best things she had known. The Duke walked toward her across the hall, not with the measured footsteps of the first arrival. Those had belonged to a man who needed to be certain of his ground before he put his foot on it. These were his own footsteps, the ones she had learned over months of mornings and evenings and library hours. Steady, unhurried, belonging entirely to him. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her the way he looked at her, completely, without adjustment, with the full attention of someone who had decided where it was going and was not reconsidering. He said, "Come in." She said, "I am in." He looked at her for a moment, with the thing in his face that had been arriving toward a smile for months, and had not quite managed it, and today, it arrived, small and real, and entirely his. The first full smile she had seen from him, quiet and certain. The smile of someone who had been patient about something for a very long time, and finds that the patience was correct. She felt it in her chest, with the warmth of a fire that has been lit and has decided to stay. She picked up her bag. She walked past him, toward the library, where the chairs were arranged the way Edmund had arranged them, and the fire was burning, and the Hartwell collection was complete on its shelves, and 2 cups of tea were already waiting on the low table, because Edmund had known to the minute what time the carriage would arrive, and had prepared accordingly. She sat in her chair. She picked up her book. The Duke came and sat in his. Outside, the December light was clean and clear and honest about everything it touched. Inside, the fire burned. The clocks kept their patient time. The house was full. That evening, after dinner, Edmund brought something from the cellar that he had apparently been holding for an occasion he had not yet specified to anyone, including himself. He set it on the table and said, "The late Duke, the current Duke's father, acquired this 22 years ago. He intended it for a significant occasion. Several significant occasions have come and gone since then, none of which seemed suitable. He said this with the complete neutrality of a man reporting a fact. Then he set 2 glasses beside the bottle and left the room. Mara looked at the bottle. She looked at the Duke. He looked at the bottle, and then at the door through which Edmund had just departed. He has been waiting 22 years to open that, the Duke said. He has been waiting approximately 5 months, she said. He knew when the occasion was. The Duke looked at the bottle for a moment longer, then he reached out and opened it. He poured 2 glasses. He handed her one. She held it. It was a deeper color than what Edmund usually brought. Old. The smell of it was complex, in the way that old things are complex. Layered. Patient. More than one thing at once. She looked at the Duke across the table. "What would your father have said?" she said. About the occasion. The Duke thought about this. He would have made a speech, he said. He was fond of speeches. He would have referenced the history of the wine and the history of the family, and made some observation about the future that sounded more certain than the future actually is. "And what do you say?" she said. He looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. "That this is the occasion," he said. She looked at him. She felt the weight of the 2 words, not the elegance of them, which was considerable, but the weight. This, now. The occasion was not the arrangements or the formalities or the plans. It was the 2 of them in this room, with the fire burning and the clocks ticking, and the house holding its history around them. She raised her glass. He raised his. They drank. It was, as Edmund had known it would be, exactly right. Later, when the wine was finished and the dining room had returned to its evening quiet, she went upstairs and stood at the window of the guest room, her room, as she had begun to think of it, as it had been hers from the first night, and looked out at the grounds. The December night was clear, for the first time in weeks. She could see the outline of the old oak at the east corner, the largest and oldest thing on the estate, the one the builders had planned around rather than removed. She could see the path to the gate in the east wall. She could see the herb garden covered for the winter, its structure precise and maintained. She thought about the nursery at the end of the corridor. She thought about spring, when things that have been covered and kept and held would begin to move again. She thought about the plans she and the Duke had discussed, carefully and without drama, over the course of the week. The nursery to be changed into a reading room. Initially, something that could be used and made useful, without requiring that it be anything other than what it was. The east sitting room to be opened again by degrees. The formal rooms to be returned to function rather than monument. Small changes, patient ones, the kind that a house accepts when they arrive in the right order. She thought about the 7th Hartwell volume on the shelf. The old explorer, too far from his travel years to do anything but describe his house. She had thought it would be sad. Instead, she had found it oddly comforting. He described his house with the same precision he had given the mountain ranges and the northern crossings, cataloging its qualities, noting its deficiencies, observing the way light moved through it at different hours. He loved it without sentimentalizing it. He knew it the way you know something you have been inside for a very long time. She understood now what he had been doing. He was recording what he had, clearly, so that the record would be honest, so that whoever came after would know, this is what was here, this is what the light was like. She turned from the window. The room was warm and familiar and genuinely hers, not her childhood room, not a borrowed room, not a room she was using temporarily under a borrowed name. Hers. She thought about the morning she would wake in this room, as a permanent fact rather than a visiting one. She thought about reading in the library with the morning light and the tea that was always ready when Edmund had decided it was time. She thought about walking in the garden, with the gate that opened easily now, and the grounds that had room in them, and the old trees that had been there long enough to know they were staying. She thought about a man down the corridor who read histories in the mornings and underlined things in books, and said exactly what he meant, and nothing else, and had placed a book on her desk once without explanation, because he had noticed the shape of what she was missing, and had filled it. She thought, I have been here 6 times, and each time I have arrived differently. The first time afraid and composed, the second time determined, the third as myself, the fourth as someone who had spoken a truth, and was waiting to see what it built, the fifth, with all of it settled, the sixth, today, as the person who was going to stay. She was going to stay. Not because it had been arranged. Not because her family needed her to. Not because the financial situation demanded it, or because a letter with a wolf seal had set a chain of events in motion that had deposited her here. She was going to stay, because she was the person who lived here now. Because the library was her library, and the chairs were their chairs, and Edmund was going to continue being subtly satisfied for the foreseeable future, and Rose's biscuits were excellent, and the grounds had room for a person to think in, and the December light was honest, and the house had stopped being empty. She was going to stay, because a man who had been called cold and feared was in the next corridor, reading something probably dry and necessary, and he was the specific person she had decided on, and that decision was hers alone, made freely, without debt to any other consideration. She got into bed. She looked at the ceiling. The fire threw its light in the familiar pattern. She thought about Ilara, who would visit in the spring, and walk in the grounds, and probably have things to say about the herb garden that were incisive and accurate. She thought about her mother, who would come and inspect the household management with the quiet thoroughness of someone who approves of good management as a matter of principle. She thought about her father, who would come and walk through the rooms and look at the library, and probably say something sideways that meant, I was wrong about most things, but this was not among them. She thought about Edmund, who had been waiting 22 years to open a specific bottle for a specific occasion, and had known to within a day when that occasion was arriving. She thought about Aldrich Vane, who had known from the third day and had chosen to know quietly until she was ready, because he was patient in the way of someone who had learned patience the hard way and had decided to keep it. She thought, it was a very long way from the letter on the breakfast table to here. She thought, it was not a long way at all. It was exactly the distance between a closed thing and an open one. The fire settled in the grate. The house ticked quietly around her. Outside, the clear December night was very still. She was still. But the stillness was different now from any stillness she had carried before. It was not the stillness of managing, not the stillness of waiting, not the stillness of performing composure under pressure. It was the stillness of a person who is exactly where they have decided to be. She closed her eyes. She thought, briefly, of the single curl Ilara had loosed from her pin on the morning of the first visit, the small thing, the detail, the careful construction of a version of herself that would not be recognized as herself. She had walked through that front door in someone else's arrangements, with someone else's name, and had been quietly and completely seen anyway. By the third day, he had known. He had watched her say the wrong name, and hold the wrong cup, and recall the wrong preference, and had seen, underneath all of it, the actual person, and had decided, this is worth continuing. She thought about what it meant to be worth continuing. She had never thought of herself in those terms before, not because she had low regard for herself. She knew her own qualities clearly, because she was good at accurate assessment, including of herself. But worth continuing was different from knowing your qualities. Worth continuing was what someone else decided about you, based on all of you, including the inconvenient and the unplanned, and the parts that arrived under false pretenses, and then persisted in being genuine. She had been worth continuing. She was going to be worth continuing. She opened her eyes, the ceiling, the firelight, the particular pattern of this room. She closed them again. She slept. In the morning, the house was already awake when she came downstairs. Rose was in the kitchen. Edmund was in the corridor doing his circuit. The Duke was in the library. She could see him through the half-open door as she came down the stairs, in his chair, her original chair, the one he had sat in to give it to her, and had kept giving to her, and which she now understood was his way of saying, I saved this for someone worth saving it for. She pushed the door open. He looked up. Good morning, he said. Good morning, she said. She went to her chair. Edmund appeared with tea. The morning light came through the high window at its clean December angle, honest and clear. She picked up the 7th Hartwell. He picked up his history. Outside, the estate was quiet and ordered and exactly as it had been kept all these years, waiting. Inside, the library was full.